June 21st, 1941, Moscow, Stavka headquarters. 11:47 p.m. The candle flame bent sideways as Georgy Zhukov exhaled, finger tracing a red line on the map spread before him. The line ran from the Polish border through Minsk, curved slightly at Smolensk, then continued straight as an arrow toward the Kremlin's walls. Electricity had been rationed again, Stalin's paranoia about sabotage, so the general staff worked by candlelight like medieval monks plotting crusades in reverse. His aide, a nervous lieutenant whose name Zhukov could never remember, cleared his throat from the doorway. The question came hesitant, almost apologetic in its timing. "Comrade General, the fortifications at Smolensk. If we cannot hold the city, why concentrate so many divisions there?" Zhukov's finger stopped at Smolensk, pressed down hard enough to wrinkle the paper. The candle threw his shadow across the wall, making him look twice his actual size. A giant bent over the map of Russia, like some ancient god deciding which pieces of the earth to sacrifice. "Because we don't need to stop them there, Lieutenant. We need to drown them." The aide blinked, understanding nothing. Zhukov didn't elaborate. In 36 hours, Operation Barbarossa would explode across the border with the force of 1,000 hurricanes. In 36 hours, he would set a trap that required 300,000 Soviet lives as bait. The arithmetic was simple, brutal, necessary. Moscow needed time. Smolensk would buy it. The price was already calculated, already accepted, already mourning itself in the ledgers of history before a single shot had been fired. The candle guttered. Somewhere in the building, a clock struck midnight. June 22nd had arrived. 400 kilometers west, along the Soviet-German border, Senior Lieutenant Dmitri Volkov woke to a sound that shouldn't exist. "You are 34 years old. You taught history at Kyiv State University for 9 years before conscription found you in the first wave of mobilization. You commanded a classroom of bored teenagers debating whether Napoleon could have taken Moscow if he'd arrived in July instead of September. Now you command 3rd Platoon, 154th Rifle Regiment, 16th Army, and you're about to learn that history doesn't debate, it devours." The sound came again. Not thunder. Too rhythmic. Too mechanical. Freight trains screaming overhead, except there were no tracks in the sky. The ground beneath your cot vibrated, a tremor that climbed through the wooden legs and into your spine and settled in your teeth like the beginning of an earthquake that would never stop. 3:15 a.m. The first shell landed 50 meters from the barracks, close enough that the explosion blew out every window simultaneously. Glass became a horizontal rain of razors. The smell hit you before the sound registered. Pine resin from trees shattered into splinters, mixed with cordite sharp enough to burn the inside of your nose. The taste came next. Copper flooding your mouth, the flavor of fear distilled into something you could swallow or spit depending on how much time you had left to live. Private Alexei Gromov stood in the doorway, 19 years old, farm boy from Kursk Oblast, broad shoulders built from hauling wheat, hands that had never held anything more dangerous than a pitchfork until 3 months ago. His face looked gray in the pre-dawn darkness, eyes wide enough to see the whites all around. "Lieutenant, what do we do?" Your answer would haunt you for 11 weeks. 380 kilometers west, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber polished his wedding ring with the corner of his undershirt. The metal catching firelight from the campfire his squad had built in violation of blackout orders. Nobody cared about blackout anymore. The invasion started in 2 hours. Stealth was obsolete. 28 years old. Bavaria. Former mechanic at Schmidt & Sons garage in Munich, drafted 1939, trained on Panzerwagens at Grafenwohr, promoted to tank commander after Poland because the previous commander took a round through the vision slit during the Warsaw Siege. Weber believed in Germany the way other men believed in God, with the unshakable faith of someone who'd never been given reason to doubt. The photograph lay in his lap, creased from handling, showing Anna and Greta outside their apartment in Munich. Anna smiled at the camera. Greta looked away at something off-frame, probably a dog or a bird, anything more interesting than standing still for Papa's goodbye photo. 4 years old. She'd be 5 in December. His tank commander, Hauptmann Steiner, 35, veteran of France and the Low Countries, Iron Cross First Class, pinned to his tunic like a talisman against death, walked past carrying a tin cup of ersatz coffee. Weber, put that away. We'll be in Moscow by Greta's birthday. You can take her to Red Square, show her the Kremlin. Weber believed him. Why wouldn't he? Poland fell in 27 days. France in 6 weeks. The Soviets had lost to Finland. Finland, for God's sake, a nation of 3 million farmers and fishermen. Russia was a house of cards waiting for the first strong wind to collapse it into rubble. He opened the letter Anna had sent 2 weeks ago, arrived yesterday, already read 17 times. Her handwriting looked rushed, ink smudged in places where her hand had dragged across wet letters. Klaus, Greta asks every night when Papa comes home. What should I tell her? Tell her Christmas. Definitely by Christmas. He said it aloud to nobody, the words disappearing into smoke from the campfire. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, 3 million German soldiers prepared to cross the border. 600,000 vehicles, 600,000 horses, 4,000 aircraft. The largest ground invasion in human history, and Klaus Weber, tank commander, Panzer IV Wehrmacht 404, 2nd Panzer Group, believed himself immortal. He was wrong. He had 7 months to live. But in this moment, polishing his wedding ring, while his daughter slept 2,000 kilometers away, he believed in Christmas. The sun rose cold and golden over Eastern Europe. 3:15 a.m. became 3:16, then 3:17. History held its breath. Then hell arrived with a sound like the world tearing itself in half. Adolf Hitler, watching from his headquarters at the Wolf's Lair, believed he understood Russia. He'd read the intelligence reports, studied the maps, calculated the distances. The Red Army was a colossus with feet of clay, he'd told his generals, a rotting giant sustained by fear and lies. One good kick and the entire structure would collapse. What Hitler couldn't see from his maps and his bunkers and his delusions, beneath the Russian soil, something ancient had begun to wake. Not a colossus, a monster, the kind that had swallowed Swedish kings and Polish armies and Mongol hordes and Napoleon's Grande Armée. It didn't fight with tanks or planes or the theories of modern warfare. It fought with time and earth and the slow suffocation of distance. It fought with arithmetic. And in Moscow, by candlelight, Dmitri Zhukov had already done the math. June 22, 1941. Dawn. Klaus Weber's Panzer IV lurched forward, 14th tank in a column of 60, tracks chewing through the dirt road that separated Germany's forward positions from Soviet territory. The engine roared, a mechanical thunder that drowned out thought, reduced the world to vibration and diesel smoke and the metallic taste of adrenaline. The border post appeared through the morning haze, a wooden guard shack, a red and white striped barrier arm, a Soviet soldier standing beside it with a cigarette dangling from his mouth. The soldier looked up as the panzers approached. His mouth opened. The cigarette fell. He ran. Weber's tank crushed the barrier without slowing, the wood splintering beneath 30 tons of German steel like kindling beneath a boot. The Blitzkrieg had begun. The first week became a fever dream of speed and destruction. June 22nd through 28th, 6 days that rewrote every assumption about modern warfare, every calculation about what was possible when combined arms doctrine met an unprepared enemy. Day 1. Crossed the Bug River at Brest. Weber's company, 4th Wave, rolled across pontoon bridges while engineers worked waist-deep in the current, bolting flotation drums to the underside of each span. Soviet artillery tried to range the bridges, shells landing 50 meters short, then 30, then 10. Then the artillery fell silent because the observers were dead or running or both. 300 kilometers penetrated in 24 hours. Weber wrote in his journal that night, hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. June 22nd, like driving through a dream. They run before we even fire. Is this war or is this something else? Day 3, Branovici captured. The town's defenders, maybe 200 soldiers, maybe fewer, retreated so fast they abandoned their equipment. Weber's platoon found a T-26 light tank, fuel tank full, ammunition loaded, engine still warm. Just abandoned. Hauptmann Steiner walked around the Soviet tank 3 times, examining it like an archaeologist studying some inexplicable artifact. Who abandons a tank with fuel in it? Nobody answered. There was no answer. The Red Army was evaporating like morning dew beneath the summer sun. Day 6. Minsk falls. 100,000 Soviet soldiers killed or captured. The city's center burned, black smoke rising so high it looked like a thunderhead, visible for 50 kilometers. Weber's company bivouacked in a park on the western outskirts, tanks parked beneath oak trees older than the Bismarck. German radio broadcast victory bulletins every hour. The announcers' voices carried a manic edge, disbelief trying to masquerade as triumph. The Red Army has been annihilated. Moscow will be ours in weeks. Weber believed them because belief required less effort than doubt. But during rest breaks, when the tanks sat silent and the crews dismounted to piss and smoke and eat whatever rations they could scrounge, he noticed things. The roads first. Not paved, not like France or Poland, just dirt, ruts deep enough to lose a motorcycle wheel. Dust that got into everything. Eyes, food, rifle mechanisms, the spaces between your teeth. The dust had a reddish tint, not brown like Bavarian soil. It stained uniforms, turned white undershirts pink, made every man look like he'd been rolling in rust. The horizons next, flat. No mountains, no hills, just endless grass and sky meeting at a line so distant it looked like the edge of the world. Standing on top of his tank's turret during a 10-minute break, Weber turned 360 degrees and saw nothing but grass in every direction. The flatness made you feel small, insignificant, an ant crawling across a map too large to comprehend. The smell surprised him most. Wildflowers. Even in the middle of an invasion, even with villages burning and corpses rotting in ditches, Ukraine still smelled like summer. Sweet clover and wild thyme growing along the roadsides, released into the air by the passage of tank treads. Sometimes at dawn, before the diesel engines started and the guns began their morning thunder, you could close your eyes and pretend you were home in Bavaria, walking through alpine meadows with Anna and Greta. Then someone would scream an order, and the illusion shattered like glass. 400 kilometers east, Dmitri Volkov led his platoon through a fighting retreat that looked like chaos but wasn't. June 24th, 48 hours since the invasion began. Your regiment, what remained of it, received written orders delivered by motorcycle courier, the paper still damp with morning dew. Conduct fighting withdrawal to Berezina River line. Delay enemy minimum 48 hours per sector. Destroy all bridges, deny enemy supplies, evacuate civilians east. Signed, Marshal S.K. Timoshenko, Commander, Western Front. You read the orders 3 times, understanding crystallizing like ice in your stomach. This wasn't panic. This wasn't the collapse that German radio kept crowing about. This was planned. They knew this was coming. Your superiors, someone, somewhere, had predicted this catastrophe and prepared for it. The orders meant dying slowly instead of dying quickly. Acceptable arithmetic. Your platoon, started with 38 men on June 22nd, now down to 29, executed the withdrawal with the grim efficiency of men who understood they were already dead, just hadn't stopped moving yet. Ambush the German scouts at crossroads, blow the bridge after the last truck crosses, shoot out the tires on trucks you can't take, pour sugar in the fuel tanks, smash the engine blocks with sledgehammers, burn the wheat fields, drive the livestock east or slaughter them in place, whatever's faster. Leave nothing. Private Gromov, shoulder bandaged from a ricochet 2 days ago, helped you mine a bridge over the Shara River. 12 charges, wired in series, command detonator placed in a ditch 200 meters away. You waited in the ditch for 6 hours, mosquitoes thick as fog, watching the bridge through binoculars. 1400 hours, German motorcycle scout appeared, stopped at the bridge's eastern end, examined the planking for mines, found nothing. You'd buried them too deep, waterproofed the charges in oilcloth, the wires invisible beneath mud. The scout waved forward the main column. You counted tanks. 1, 5, 10, 15, 20. A company-sized element. Panzer IIIs and IVs. Tracks rattling across the wooden bridge deck. You waited until tank number 12 reached the center span. Then you twisted the detonator handle. The bridge exploded upward, a fountain of splintered wood and steel and water from the river below. Tank number 12 disappeared into the fireball, turret separating from the hull, spinning through the air like a coin flipped by a giant's hand. Tanks 11 and 13 survived, 11 on the eastern bank, 13 on the western, but the middle was gone, replaced by a gap 50 meters wide where the river boiled with debris. Gromov, lying beside you in the ditch, let out a breath he'd been holding since you grabbed the detonator. "We stopped them, Lieutenant. For 6 hours, maybe 8 if they don't have bridging equipment." His face fell. 19 years old, still believed that small victories meant something, that stopping one tank company mattered in a war measured in millions. You didn't tell him the truth. Let him keep his faith a little longer. You withdrew east toward the next river, the next bridge, the next 6 hours bought with cunning and high explosives, and the lives of men who volunteered to be rear guard and never caught up. June 29th. 7 days into the invasion, near Slutsk, 60 kilometers southwest of Minsk, your platoon, now 23 men, waited in a forest that smelled like pine sap and death. The Germans had taken to burning villages, suspected of harboring partisans. In the wind carried smoke from a dozen different fires, mixing with the natural forest scents until you couldn't separate them anymore. The ambush was simple. Anti-tank rifle team, you plus 3 men including Gromov, positioned at the forest's edge. Target, German column using the main road. Tactic, fire 1 shot at the lead vehicle, disable it, block the road, withdraw before the Germans could organize return fire. The column appeared at 0800 hours. Panzers, maybe a company, 30 or 40 vehicles. You selected the 3rd tank, not the 1st, which would draw immediate attention, not the last, which could reverse quickly. The 3rd. Gromov spotted for you, whispering ranges, corrections, his voice steady despite the shaking in his hands. 300 meters, no wind. Target is that one, the one with white cross on the turret. You sighted through the PTRD's scope. The anti-tank rifle was a brutal weapon, fired a 14.5mm armor-piercing round with enough recoil to dislocate your shoulder if you held it wrong. The Germans called them elephant guns. You'd seen them penetrate 30 millimeters of steel at 200 meters. The white cross filled your scope. You breathed out, squeezed. The rifle kicked like a mule, slamming your shoulder back, your ears ringing despite the cotton wadding you'd stuffed in them. Through the scope, you saw the round hit the Panzer's turret. A flash of sparks, a spray of paint chips, then nothing. No penetration. The round had bounced. German return fire came instantaneous and overwhelming. High explosive rounds detonated in the trees around you. Air burst shrapnel shredding pine branches, bark flying like wooden shrapnel. The noise was apocalyptic, a wall of sound that erased thought, reduced existence to pure animal panic. Back, withdraw, go! Your team scattered, running through the forest, rifles abandoned, because speed mattered more than firepower. Behind you, the forest erupted with impacts, German machine guns stitching patterns through the undergrowth, tracer rounds setting dry pine needles on fire. You counted heads at the rally point, 300 meters deeper into the forest. 4 men, all present. Gromov bleeding from a shoulder wound. Not the old one, a new one, fresh blood soaking through his tunic. How bad? He moved his arm, winced, moved it again. No bone showing. Exit wound visible on the back of his shoulder, clean through. I can walk, I can shoot. Then we walk. But before withdrawing, you look back toward the road, toward the German column now reorganizing after the ambush. Through the trees, you saw soldiers dismounting from the tanks, examining the forest edge. 1 man, tank commander, probably, judging by the binoculars around his neck, walked to where your position had been, bent down, picked up something from the ground. Your rifle. You'd left it behind in the panic. The German turned the rifle over in his hands, examining the Cyrillic inscription on the stock. Kurskaya Oblast, 1938. Kursk Oblast, 1938. The rifle had been issued to some other soldier, some other war, passed down through the armory system until it reached you 3 months ago. The German looked up, stared directly at the forest where you hid 200 meters away, too far to see clearly, but you felt his gaze like pressure against your chest. You could take the shot. PPSH submachine gun, 40 rounds left, 200-meter range. Difficult but possible, Gromov whispered beside you. Lieutenant, we should... I know. The impossible choice presented itself with crystalline clarity. Shoot the German. Kill him. Avenge the 7 men you'd lost since June 22nd. But shooting revealed your position. Revealed your position, the Germans would respond with artillery or air support or both. You'd die. Gromov would die, 19 years old with his whole life unlived. The rest of your platoon would die. 23 men reduced to 0 for the satisfaction of 1 dead German, or retreat, let him live. Fight again tomorrow. The arithmetic was simple, brutal, necessary. You withdrew, leaving the German standing there with your rifle in his hands, and you hated yourself for the choice even as you made it. Behind you, through the trees, you heard the German column resume its advance. The tanks' engines, the infantry's march, all of it fading into distance as they rolled east toward Minsk, toward Smolensk, toward Moscow. And you thought, I'll meet him again. That soldier. I'll see his face one more time before this war's over. Klaus Weber stood in the forest clearing, turning the Soviet rifle over in his hands, examining the crude but functional design. Mosin Nagant, he recognized from intelligence briefings. Standard Red Army issue, 5-round internal magazine, bolt action, effective range 800 meters in trained hands. The woodstock was rough, unfinished, marked with Cyrillic letters he couldn't read. He traced the inscription with one finger, wondering about the man who'd owned this rifle, fired it, abandoned it. Alive or dead, running or regrouping. Would they meet again? Hauptmann Steiner appeared at his shoulder. Weber, we're moving out. Leave the Russian trash. He dropped the rifle, watched it fall into the pine needles and disappear. But something stayed with him, something he couldn't articulate, a feeling like recognition. The forest had watched him. Someone in those trees had him in their sights and chose not to shoot. Why? The question haunted him as the column reformed and continued east. Through forests that seemed alive with invisible threats, across rivers that ran red with blood and oil, toward a city whose name he could barely pronounce. Smolensk, July 8, 1941. 16 days since the invasion began, Dmitri Volkov crossed the Dnieper River into Smolensk at dawn, riding in the back of a ZIS-5 truck with 19 other soldiers. The last remnants of your platoon after 1,100 kilometers of fighting retreat from the Polish border. The truck's suspension was shot, every pothole transmitted directly through the wooden bench into your spine, but nobody complained. Complaints required energy none of you possessed. The bridge came into view as the truck rounded a curve in the approach road. Medieval stonework, built 1595, according to the brass plaque you glimpsed as you rolled past. Arches spanning the Dnieper's brown current. The bridge had survived 3 centuries of Russian history, Polish sieges, Swedish invasions, Napoleon's retreat in 1812, the Revolution, the Civil War. It would not survive the next 8 weeks. Private Gromov, shoulder newly bandaged by a field medic back in Vitebsk, sat across from you in the truck bed. His eyes were hollow, skin stretched tight over his skull from weight loss and dehydration, but he still tried to smile when he caught you looking. Lieutenant, you said we'd make it to Smolensk. We made it. Now what? The truck driver answered before you could, shouted back through the open cab window, voice competing with the engine's rattle. Now we die here instead of dying there. Progress, comrades. Nobody laughed. The joke wasn't funny because it wasn't a joke. Smolensk revealed itself in layers as the truck descended from the bridge into the city's western outskirts. Medieval walls first, built from local limestone during the reign of Boris Godunov. 38 towers spaced along 6 kilometers of fortification. The walls were incomplete. Soviets had demolished sections in the 1920s to modernize the city, but enough remained to give an impression of ancient strength, permanence, the illusion that stone could stop steel. Orthodox churches next. The Assumption Cathedral dominated the skyline, golden dome catching the early sun, throwing light back into the sky like a mirror signal to God that believers still gathered here, still prayed, still hoped for salvation or at least for a quick death. Smaller churches clustered around the cathedral, St. John the Divine, Church of the Archangel Michael, each with their own copper domes gone green with age, each ringing their bells in a discordant chorus that sounded less like worship and more like warning. Stalin-era construction formed the third layer. Concrete apartment blocks, 5 stories tall, windows arranged in perfect rows, no balconies, no ornamentation, pure function built by prison labor during the first 5-year plan. The buildings looked identical, gray and featureless, which made the city easy to navigate. All you needed was a compass and the knowledge that every concrete block was exactly 30 meters wide, but impossible to hide in once the bombing started. The streets were chaos. Civilians fled east, pushing carts loaded with possessions, sewing machines, icons, photograph albums, the detritus of lives abandoned in panic. They moved against the current of military vehicles trying to enter the city, creating gridlock at every intersection. You saw an old woman screaming at a tank driver, beating the tank's glacis plate with her fists, her babushka scarf coming loose and revealing gray hair that caught the wind. Fascists! Devils! You bring death to our city! The tank driver ignored her, ground forward in low gear, tracks chewing pavement, forcing her to step aside or be crushed. She stepped aside, still screaming, and you realized she wasn't cursing the tank driver. She was cursing you, the Red Army, all of you who were supposed to stop the Germans at the border and instead had led them here, to her home, her church, her 1,000-year-old city that smelled like bread from working bakeries and cabbage from mass soup kitchens and diesel from T-34 tanks arriving from the Urals. The smell would change. Soon it would smell like blood and smoke and the charred meat stench of bodies burning in collapsed buildings. But on July 8th, at dawn, Smolensk still smelled like life. Your truck stopped at a commandeered school building on the city's eastern edge, now serving as a temporary battalion headquarters. Peeling yellow paint on the walls, playground empty except for trenches that scarred the dirt where children used to play football, swings still hanging from their frames, but stripped of seats. The chains would be useful for vehicle towing. A lieutenant you didn't recognize directed your group into the school's basement, down concrete stairs that smelled like mold and old textbooks and fierce sweat from the 200 soldiers already crammed into the space. Candles provided the only light, stuck to the floor with their own melted wax, casting shadows that made everyone look like corpses. You found space against a wall, slid down until you were sitting, legs stretched out, rifle across your lap. Gromov sat beside you, close enough that his shoulder touched yours. "Sir, do you think we'll hold?" The honest answer, no. The strategic answer, doesn't matter if we hold, only matters if we delay. What you said, we'll hold long enough. He accepted that, closed his eyes, asleep in seconds. 19 years old, already learned how to sleep anywhere, anytime, the veteran's most important skill. You couldn't sleep. Your mind kept calculating distances, timelines, arithmetic. 1,100 kilometers from the Polish border to Smolensk, covered by the Germans in 16 days. 69 kilometers per day average advance rate. 400 kilometers from Smolensk to Moscow. At current pace, the Germans would reach Moscow in 6 days. Maybe 7 if the mud season started early. Unacceptable. Your thoughts were interrupted by a commotion at the basement's far end. Officers gathering around a table. Map spread out, someone important arriving. You stood, moved closer, using rank to push through the crowd. Marshal Semyon Konstantinovich Timoshenko stood at the table's head, 46 years old, stocky build, scar from the Civil War cutting across his left cheek from temple to jaw, eyes like hammered iron. He wore a service tunic without decorations, just rank insignia, and he held a cigarette that had burned down to the filter without him smoking it, ash intact, impossibly long. "Comrades," his voice cut through the basement's din like a blade through butter. Everyone shut up. The situation is this. German forces, approximately 900,000 men, approach from the west. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal von Bock. Their objective is Moscow. Our objective is to stop them here. He paused, let the word here hang in the air like a death sentence. Stavka asks, "Can you hold Smolensk?" Silence. Nobody wanted to answer honestly. I answer, we cannot, we will not. Shock rippled through the assembled officers. Someone started to object. You couldn't see who, but Timoshenko raised one hand and the objection died unspoken. We will do something better. We will bleed them. Every day, every hour, every meter. We trade blood for time. He drew on the map with a grease pencil 3 concentric circles around Smolensk's center. Line 1. Outer suburbs, 15-kilometer radius. We delay them 3 days. Circle. Line 2. City proper, streets, buildings. We fight 2 weeks. Circle. Line 3. Dnieper West Bank and Citadel. Last stand as long as possible. Circle. Moscow needs 6 weeks to prepare. We will give them 8, or die trying. You realize, standing there in the candlelit basement, that you were listening to your own death sentence. 6 weeks meant August 20th. It was July 8th now. 43 days. At 70% casualties, the standard for a defensive operation, your battalion of 1,200 men would lose 840 killed or wounded. Statistical certainty said you were already dead. Just hadn't stopped breathing yet. But Timoshenko wasn't finished. While we hold, 1,500 factories evacuate to the Urals. While we fight, Siberian divisions mobilize. While we die, Moscow arms. He crushed the cigarette under his boot, ash finally falling. We are the shield, cracked, breaking, but still standing. Each hour you hold equals 100 T-34s built. Each day equals 1 division saved. You are worth more dead here than alive in Moscow. Acceptable arithmetic. Someone, you never discovered who, asked the question everyone was thinking. What if we withdraw now? Save 300,000 men? Timoshenko's response came flat, factual, terrifying. Then we lose Moscow in August. Better to lose 300,000 men in July than 200 million in September. The meeting dissolved into smaller briefings, company commanders receiving specific assignments, sector boundaries, ammunition allotments. You received yours from a captain who looked 17. Hold the approaches to Assumption Cathedral, 2 city blocks, maximum duration 4 days. 4 days, 96 hours, 5,760 minutes, each one bought with blood. You left the briefing, climbed back up the stairs into morning light that felt obscene in its normalcy. The sun still rose. Birds still sang in trees that would be splinters by week's end. Life continued, oblivious to its own impending extinction. Gromov waited at the top of the stairs. Lieutenant, where do we dig in? You pointed northeast, toward the cathedral's golden dome visible over the rooftops. There, we hold the cathedral. How long? The honest answer, the one that would crush what remained of his 19-year-old optimism. Until we're dead. What you said, until they relieve us. He nodded, accepting the lie, and you hated yourself for telling it even as you recognized its necessity. Men fight better with hope, even false hope, even hope that arithmetically guaranteed their extinction. That night, sleepless in a commandeered apartment's basement, you wandered Smolensk's streets under cover of darkness and mandatory blackout. The city had transformed in 12 hours. Every intersection bristled with anti-tank obstacles, steel hedgehogs welded from rail tracks, concrete pyramids called dragon's teeth, trenches zigzagging through parks and playgrounds. Machine gun nests occupied the upper floors of apartment buildings, sandbags stacked in windows, fields of fire carefully calculated to create overlapping kill zones. You passed the Dnieper's edge, stood on the embankment, looked down at brown water that reflected nothing, too turbid to show even the stars. The river had a smell, silt and iron, and something organic you couldn't identify. Maybe fish, maybe not. Downstream, silhouettes moved on the water. Boats, you realized. Small ones, fishing skiffs and rowboats, crossing from the west bank to the east, ferrying civilians who'd been trapped on the wrong side when the defenses went up. Mothers holding children, old men carrying bundles, everyone silent, oars muffled with rags to deaden sound. An old woman climbed the embankment near where you stood, 70, maybe older, wearing black. Always black, the universal uniform of Russian widows. She carried a bag of belongings, shapeless cloth sagging with the weight of a life reduced to portable essentials. She looked at you, your uniform, your rank, your rifle, and spat at your feet. You're running like cowards. We're withdrawing to prepared positions, babushka. Same thing. My husband fought Germans in the last war. He didn't run. He died at Tannenberg, but he didn't run. I'm sorry for your loss. Don't be sorry, be better. My husband is dead 25 years and he's still braver than you. She walked past, disappearing into the darkness, leaving you standing there with her contempt burning hotter than shame. But she was wrong. You weren't running toward cowardice. You were running toward the only position that mattered, the place where you could trade your life at maximum exchange rate, where your death bought the most time, the most distance, the most runway for Moscow to prepare its own defenses. You were running toward Smolensk, and Smolensk was running toward you. Geography and destiny converging at a city that would become a charnel house, a meat grinder, a trap baited with the lives of men who'd already calculated their own extinction and accepted the mathematics. Acceptable arithmetic. July 10th, 1941. Midnight minus 10 hours. Dmitri Volkov stood in a basement that smelled like wet stone and human bodies packed too closely together, listening to a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. The door to the inner briefing room hung slightly ajar, someone's carelessness or deliberate intelligence leak, you never determined which. Through the gap, you saw Marshal Timoshenko bent over a map table, cigarette smoke forming a halo around his scarred face. Two other officers flanked him, both colonels, both older men who'd survived the purges through luck or competence or some combination that defied analysis. One of the colonels spoke, voice carrying through the gap. Comrade Marshal, we could withdraw now, save 300,000 men, pull back to the Desna River, establish stronger defenses. Timoshenko's response came after a long pause, long enough that you thought he might be considering the suggestion. And lose Moscow in August? No. But the casualties are acceptable. 300,000 men. Comrade Marshal? Timoshenko lifted something from the table, a sealed envelope, red wax stamp visible even from your position 15 feet away. He broke the seal, extracted a single sheet of paper, read aloud. From General G.K. Zhukov, Chief of General Staff, Stavka, dated July 3rd. His voice dropped into a monotone, the voice of a man reading his own execution order. Smolensk must hold until August 10th minimum. Acceptable losses, 70% of defending force. Strategic value, delay enemy 6 weeks, force premature winter offensive. Every day Smolensk holds equals 1 Siberian division mobilized, 1 factory evacuated, 1 defensive line completed before Moscow. The arithmetic is not negotiable. Silence filled the briefing room like water filling a sinking ship. 70% casualties. 300,000 men defending Smolensk. 70% of 300,000 equals 210,000. Killed, wounded, captured, missing. An entire army's worth of corpses, statistically guaranteed, pre-calculated, accepted before the first shot was fired. You were already dead. The paperwork just hadn't caught up yet. One of the colonels found his voice again, smaller now, defeated. And if we fail, if we cannot hold 6 weeks? Timoshenko refolded the order, returned it to its envelope, tucked the envelope into his tunic pocket. Then Russia falls. Then the Urals remain undefended. Then Moscow evacuates and Stalin flees to Kuibyshev, and the Soviet Union collapses into civil war, while Germans occupy everything west of the Volga. But we will not fail. Failure is not arithmetically possible because failure requires survivors, and we are already dead. He looked up from the map, directly at the door, directly at you standing in shadow beyond the gap. Senior Lieutenant Volkov, stop eavesdropping and enter. Your blood turned to ice. You stepped through the door, snapped to attention, waited for the rebuke or the bullet. Instead, Timoshenko smiled. Not a happy smile. The smile of a man who'd accepted his own death and found freedom in the acceptance. You heard? Yes, Comrade Marshal. Good. Now you understand. Now you can lead men who need to believe they're fighting for victory while you know they're dying for time. Can you do that? The impossible choice delivered as a simple question. Lie to your men about their odds, or tell them the truth and watch morale collapse. Watch them break and run. Watch the defense unravel before the Germans even arrived. Yes, Comrade Marshal. Then dismissed. And Volkov, when you lie to them, make it convincing. Men die better when they believe the lie. You saluted, left the briefing room, climbed back up stairs that felt steeper than before, emerged into night air that tasted like freedom you'd already lost. Gromov waited outside, smoking a cigarette he'd acquired through some mysterious soldier's barter network. Lieutenant, you look like you saw a ghost. I saw the future. Same thing. He offered you the cigarette. You took it, dragged deep, let the smoke burn your lungs, a small pain to distract from the larger one. Sir, are we going to win? The lie came easier than expected, almost natural, almost like truth. Yes, Private. We're going to win. He believed you because 19-year-olds need to believe in something, and you were the closest thing to certainty he had left. You finished the cigarette, crushed it under your boot, ash mixing with Smolensk's dust. Somewhere to the west, German tanks were rolling through the night, headlights off, navigating by starlight and maps in the certainty of their own inevitable victory. They were wrong, but you wouldn't live long enough to tell them so. Dawn broke over Smolensk like the opening of a furnace door. Klaus Weber stood in the commander's hatch of Panzer IV Num 404, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the horizon where the city rose from morning mist like a mirage. 48 hours ago, his company had bivouacked near Vitebsk, 80 kilometers northwest. 48 hours of continuous advance. Roads clogged with vehicles, dust clouds visible for 50 kilometers. The largest mechanized force in human history grinding toward a single objective. 900,000 German soldiers, Romanian and Hungarian divisions on the flanks, each contributing another 50,000 men, bringing the total to 1 million. 1 million men, all converging on a city whose population had been 160,000 in peacetime and was now, 200,000? More? Hauptmann Steiner climbed onto Weber's tank's hull, stood beside the turret, also scanning with binoculars. Weber, you see those clouds east of the city? Yes, Herr Hauptmann. That's not clouds, that's smoke. They're burning their own city before we arrive. Weber adjusted his binoculars, zoomed the focus, saw what Steiner had noticed. Black columns rising from Smolensk's eastern districts, maybe a dozen separate fires, too regular to be bombing damage. Deliberate, controlled. The Soviets were destroying their own infrastructure, denying the Germans supplies, shelter, anything useful. Why burn it if they're fleeing? Steiner lowered his binoculars, looked at Weber with an expression that mixed respect and pity. Because they're not fleeing. They're preparing to make us pay for every meter. The briefing came at 5:30 hours. Company commanders gathered around Hauptmann E. Steiner's command vehicle, a SDKF's 251 half-track bristling with radio antennas. The operations officer, a major whose name Weber never learned, spread a map across the half-track's hood, traced approach routes with a grease pencil. Objective, Smolensk. Population, unknown. Estimate 200,000 including military. Defending forces, Soviet 16th Army, 19th Army, 20th Army. Total strength approximately 1 million men. Someone whistled low. Equal numbers. The Blitzkrieg doctrine required 3-to-1 superiority for urban assault. Equal numbers meant months of street fighting, Stalingrad before Stalingrad had happened. The major continued, ignoring the whistle. Initial assault, 0600 hours. Luftwaffe preparatory bombardment, duration 6 hours. Ground assault begins 1200 hours. Expected resistance, heavy. Expected duration, 72 hours. 72 hours. 3 days. Weber wrote it in his journal, underlined it twice, tried to believe it. The major rolled up the map, nodded to Steiner, departed in a cloud of exhaust from the half-track's diesel engine. Steiner gathered his company around Weber's tank, 12 vehicles, 48 men counting crews and attached infantry. Gentlemen, the operations officer is optimistic. We won't take Smolensk in 3 days. We'll take it in 3 weeks if we're lucky, 3 months if we're not. This is not Poland. This is not France. The Soviets are fighting for their homes, and men fight hardest when defending what they cannot afford to lose. He paused, let that sink in, then continued. Expected casualties, 50%. Half of you will die here. The other half will wish you had. But we are German soldiers. We do not flee. We do not surrender. We advance until the enemy breaks, or we do. Weber checked his watch. 0:07 hours. 3 minutes to bombardment. He dropped into the tank's interior, sealed the hatch, switched to intercom. Driver, engine start. Gunner, load high explosive. Loader, secure ammunition. Radio operator, confirm frequency. The crew responded with mechanical efficiency. The Maybach engine coughed, caught, settled into a steady rumble. The turret's electric traverse hummed as the gunner rotated left, checking systems. The radio hissed static, then cleared as they locked onto the company net. 600 hours exactly. The sky to the west exploded with sound. 200 Stukas diving from 10,000 feet. Sirens wailing, bombs falling like black rain. Junkers U-88s followed, level bombing from 8,000 feet, carpet patterns designed to saturate entire city blocks. Heinkel He-111s brought up the rear, incendiary loads intended to start fires that would burn for days. The noise was apocalyptic. Each bomb created its own thunder. Hundreds of individual detonations merging into a continuous roar that made thought impossible, reduced existence to pure sensation, vibration through the tank's hull, heat radiating from engine and sun, the taste of copper fear that coated your mouth like oil. Weber watched through his periscope as Smolensk disappeared beneath smoke and fire. The golden dome of the Assumption Cathedral caught sunlight for a moment, a last defiant flash, then vanished as incendiary bombs ignited the surrounding district. Churches burned, apartment buildings collapsed. Medieval walls crumbled under high explosive impacts, 600-year-old stonework reduced to rubble in seconds. The bombardment lasted not 6 hours but 8, continuing past the scheduled ground assault time because targets kept appearing. Anti-aircraft positions, supply depots, columns of reinforcements trying to enter the city. The Luftwaffe pilots, drunk on success and unlimited ammunition, kept diving and bombing until their aircraft ran dry. 1,400 hours. The bombing finally ceased. Silence rushed back like floodwater, filling the vacuum left by explosions. Weber's ears rang, a high-pitched whine that would last for days. He popped the hatch, breathed air thick with smoke and brick dust, and the chemical stink of high explosives. Smolensk looked like the end of the world. Black smoke rose in columns so high they merged with actual clouds, creating a roofline of soot that blocked the sun, turned afternoon into twilight. Fires burned in every district, orange flames visible through broken windows, white-hot fires in collapsed buildings where fuel or ammunition had ignited. The medieval walls had gaps you could drive a tank through, stones scattered across approach roads like dice thrown by giants. Hauptmann Steiner's voice crackled over the radio. All units, advance. Follow marked routes. Watch for mines. Expect ambush at every intersection. Move out. Weber's company rolled forward, tracks biting dirt, engines straining as the panzers climbed the slope, leading to Smolensk's western outskirts. The approach road was cratered, shell holes overlapping, requiring the driver to navigate between obstacles like threading a needle. They reached the first buildings at 14:30 hours. The silence was wrong. Bombed cities made noise. Fires crackling, walls collapsing, survivors screaming. Smolensk was silent except for the crackling flames and the rumble of German tanks. No civilians, no soldiers. Just empty streets and burning buildings and the sense of being watched by invisible eyes. Weber's tank advanced down Bolshaya Sovetskaya Street, main thoroughfare bisecting the city east to west. The street was 12 meters wide, barely sufficient for 2 tanks side by side. Buildings rose 3 and 4 stories on both sides, stone and brick, windows like empty eye sockets, darkness visible beyond shattered glass. The company spread out, 2 columns, 6 tanks per column, infantry following on foot. Standard urban assault doctrine. Tanks provide fire support, infantry clears buildings, engineers handle mines and barricades. They advanced 200 meters. Nothing. 300 meters. Still nothing. 400 meters. Weber's sense of wrongness intensified into certainty. This wasn't right. Bombed cities should have rubble-blocking streets, survivors fleeing, defenders firing from cover. Smolensk was empty as a tomb. 500 meters. The lead tank, commanded by Feldwebel Hoffman, reported over radio. Approaching intersection with Dzerzhinsky Street. No contacts, no movement. Sir, where are... The anti-tank rifle shot came from 3 stories up, 90 degrees right, 3rd building past the intersection. The round penetrated Hoffman's tank turret at the joint between turret ring and hull, found the gap in the armor, punched through into the crew compartment. Hoffman's tank stopped. Hatches remained closed. Smoke began leaking from the vision slits. The ambush erupted from everywhere simultaneously. Machine guns opened fire from 2nd and 3rd story windows, 8 or 10 positions. Overlapping fields of fire that created a steel net across the street. Tracer rounds sparked off tank armor, ricocheted into the air, set wooden window frames ablaze. Molotov cocktails arced down from rooftops, glass bottles trailing smoke, shattering against turrets, spreading burning gasoline across steel surfaces. Weber's tank was 4th in column, protected by the 3 vehicles ahead. He watched through his periscope as Soviet infantry materialized from basements, from ground floor windows, from behind rubble piles, throwing grenades at close range, firing rifles at tank vision slits, targeting any exposed flesh. Gunner, target that window. 3rd building, 2nd floor. High explosive. Identified. Fire! The 75mm cannon roared, turret interior filling with cordite smoke. Through the periscope, Weber saw the round detonate inside the building, blowing out the entire 2nd floor, bricks and timber, and bodies tumbling into the street. But the machine gun fire didn't stop. New positions opened up to replace silenced ones. Soviet defenders flowing through the buildings like water, appearing wherever Germans weren't looking, vanishing before return fire could find them. This was urban combat, the kind that doctrine manuals warned against and generals tried to avoid. Every window was a potential firing position. Every basement was a bunker. Every building was a fortress. Taking Smolensk wouldn't require 72 hours. It would require 72 weeks. 300 meters away, 3 floors up in a building that smelled like burned cabbage and cordite, Dmitri Volkov watched German tanks through a gap in the rubble that used to be a wall. Your position, commandeered apartment, 3rd floor, 200 Bolshaya Sovetskaya Street. Your assets, 8 men including you, 2 DP-27 machine guns, 4 Molotov cocktails and recycled vodka bottles, 1 PTRD anti-tank rifle, 40 rounds of 14.5mm ammunition. Your orders: delay German advance maximum duration, withdraw when position becomes untenable, survive if possible. Acceptable arithmetic favored survival 0%. You'd accepted that yesterday. Private Gromov manned the PTRD, the elephant gun that had failed to penetrate German armor back in June. This time the target was closer, 200 meters versus 300, and the angle was better, side armor versus frontal armor. Gromov, 3rd tank in column, side shot just above the tracks. Ammunition storage. Identified, Lieutenant. Fire when ready. The PTRD's report was deafening in the enclosed space, louder than thunder, loud enough to make your ears bleed if you hadn't stuffed them with cotton. Through the observation gap, you watched the round streak downward, saw the impact spark against steel, saw the tank shudder but continue moving. No penetration again. German armor was too thick, too well-angled, too advanced for weapons designed in the 1930s against targets from the 1920s. But the shot had accomplished its purpose, revealed your position, drew German attention, forced them to respond, to waste time and ammunition on a target that was already withdrawing. German return fire came instant and overwhelming. A high explosive round hit the building's corner, 10 meters from your position, detonating with a flash that temporarily blinded you. The floor shook, ancient timber beams groaning, plaster dust raining from the ceiling. Withdraw! Backstairs! Move! Your team grabbed weapons, abandoned the heavy machine guns, too slow to carry. kept the rifles and pistols. You followed Gromov down the rear staircase, 3 flights taken at a run, boots hammering on worn wooden steps that had been there since before the revolution. The ground floor was chaos. Smoke, fire, rubble, other Soviet soldiers retreating through the building's interior, using passages that connected buildings through basements and courtyards. Routes that Germans didn't know existed and wouldn't discover for another week. You emerged in an alley behind the building, narrow passage barely wide enough for 2 men side by side. Brick walls rose on both sides, 3 stories of shadows and hiding places. You ran east toward the next defensive position, boots splashing through puddles of water and oil, and blood from men who'd fled before you. Behind you, the building you just evacuated took another hit. You heard the explosion, felt the shock wave chase you down the alley, turned to see the entire 3rd floor collapse inward, walls folding like a house of cards. Dust cloud boiling into the narrow space. Gromov ran beside you, rifle clutched to his chest, breathing hard. "Lieutenant, did we kill any?" "Doesn't matter, we delayed them. 5 minutes, maybe 10, that's the objective." 5 minutes doesn't seem like much, sir. 5 minutes times 1,000 positions equals 83 hours. That's 3.5 days. Add it up, Private. The arithmetic matters. You reached the rally point, a basement 2 blocks east, accessed through a storm cellar hidden behind stacked crates. Your 8-man team had become 6. 2 missing, fate unknown, probably dead in the building collapse. The basement was already occupied by another team, 10 men from a different company, all unknown to you. The senior sergeant nodded as you entered, moved aside to make room. "How bad out there?" "Bad. Germans advancing slowly, checking every building, maybe 100 meters per hour. At this rate, they'll reach the cathedral by tomorrow evening. Then we make them slower. Simple plan, brutal execution, acceptable arithmetic. The day stretched into evening, evening into night. The fighting never stopped, just shifted from daylight to darkness. From precision shooting to blind firing into shadows. Fires provided illumination, turning night into a hellish twilight where you could see well enough to kill, but not well enough to identify targets until they were close enough to kill you. Weber's company advanced 400 meters in 10 hours, from 1400 to midnight. 400 meters purchased at the cost of 3 tanks destroyed, 12 men killed, 23 wounded. The company that had started the day with 14 tanks now operated 11, and 5 of those 11 had damage requiring field repair. Hauptmann Steiner gathered his surviving commanders at 100 hours, July 11th, day 2 of the siege. "Gentlemen, new orders from division. We halt here, consolidate gains, prepare for renewed assault at dawn. Expected relief? None. Expected reinforcements? None. Expected duration? Unknown." Someone asked the question everyone was thinking. "Sir, we were told 72 hours. How long will this actually take?" Steiner's response came after a pause, long enough to feel like years. "As long as it takes, or until we run out of men, whichever comes first." July 27th, 1941. 17 days after the siege began, Klaus Weber stood beside his tank, not number 404, which had been destroyed on day 9, but Tur 17, inherited from a lieutenant who'd caught shrapnel through the throat during a close-quarters engagement that left both sides too exhausted to collect their dead. 17 days of continuous combat had transformed his company from a mechanized cavalry unit into something that resembled infantry more than armor. 9 tanks had become 4 operational, 3 damaged awaiting parts, 2 total losses. The men looked like refugees, uniforms torn, unwashed, faces blackened with soot and powder residue, eyes hollow from interrupted sleep, and the 1,000-meter stare that came from seeing too many friends die. The radio crackled at 1600 hours. Battalion net. Priority message. "All units prepare to receive operational update. Stand by." Weber climbed into his tank's interior, pressed the headphones to his ears, adjusted the volume to compensate for his partial hearing loss. Legacy of too many hours inside a firing tank without proper protection. The voice that came through belonged to a general, someone high enough that Weber had never heard him before, would never hear him again. "Attention Army Group Center. As of 15:30 hours today, July 27, 1941, the encirclement of Smolensk is complete. 2nd Panzer Group advancing from the south has linked with 3rd Panzer Group advancing from the north at the town of Yelnya, 30 kilometers east of Smolensk proper. The pocket is sealed. Approximately 300,000 enemy forces are now surrounded. All units are ordered to maintain positions, reduce the pocket, prevent breakout attempts. Victory is achieved. Heil Hitler. The radio went silent. Weber sat in the commander's seat, headphones still pressed to his ears, listening to static and the distant sound of artillery and his own breathing. Victory. The word felt hollow. Yes, they'd surrounded the Soviets. Yes, the pocket was sealed. But at what cost? His company had started Operation Barbarossa with 140 men. Current strength, 43. 70% casualties in 5 weeks. And they were calling this victory. He climbed out of the tank, stood in the street that had been Bolshaya Sovetskaya, but was now just rubble and craters, and the burned-out husks of vehicles from both sides. The Assumption Cathedral was visible in the distance. Its golden dome collapsed, the cross that had topped it lying in the courtyard like a fallen god. Hauptmann Steiner approached, walking with a limp from a wound he'd taken on day 12 and refused to have treated properly. "Weber, you heard?" "Yes, sir, we won." "Then why does it feel like we lost?" Weber had no answer. Or rather, he had an answer but couldn't articulate it. Couldn't find words for the wrongness that had settled into his bones like radiation. They'd won the battle but lost something else. Something intangible but critical. Speed, initiative, invincibility. The Blitzkrieg was supposed to be lightning. Fast, overwhelming, irresistible. Smolensk had been mud, slow and grinding and resistible. They'd advanced 100 meters per day for 17 days, purchased with blood and steel and the lives of men who'd believed the propaganda about quick victory. Steiner pulled out a map, unfolded it against his tank's hull, traced a line from Smolensk east to Moscow. 380 kilometers to Moscow. At our current rate of advance, 4 months. Winter will arrive before we do. Then we need to move faster, sir. With what? We've lost half our tanks. Fuel is rationed. Ammunition is rationed. The men are exhausted. Weber, we've won the battle and lost the war. We just haven't realized it yet. A runner arrived, breathless, carrying another dispatch. Steiner read it, face darkening with each line, then crumpled the paper and threw it into a puddle of oil and water. New orders. 2nd Panzer Group is being redeployed south to Kiev, effective immediately. But sir, Moscow waits. Hitler wants Kiev first. Something about grain supplies and strategic depth. The important thing is, we're leaving. Someone else gets to clean up this mess. Weber looked back at the cathedral's ruins, at the city that had consumed 17 days and 70% of his company, and he thought about the Soviet officer he'd seen weeks ago during the ambush near Slutsk, the one who'd chosen not to shoot, the one whose face he still remembered. Was he in there, in the pocket, trapped, awaiting death or capture? Or had he escaped, slipped through the closing jaws, lived to fight another day? Weber would never know. But that night, sleeping fitfully in the ruins of a destroyed building, he dreamed of a burning village and a moment of truce and eyes meeting across smoke and fire. In the dream, he and the Soviet officer sat across from each other in silence, both understanding that they were the same, both knowing that only one would survive, both wishing there was another way. He woke at dawn to orders to move south, to Kiev, to another battle in another city that would cost another 1,000 lives for another few kilometers of Russian soil. Behind him, Smolensk burned. Inside the pocket, 300,000 Soviet soldiers waited for rescue or death or something in between. And in Moscow, 400 kilometers east, Dmitri Volkov studied casualty reports and smiled. The trap had worked. The Germans had bought the bait, paid the price, wasted the time. Now came phase 2. Now came winter. Dmitri Volkov stood in the ruins of what had been a machine shop, now reduced to twisted metal and broken concrete, and listened to Marshal Timoshenko deliver the final briefing. July 27th, 2200 hours. The pocket had been sealed for 6 hours. 300,000 men cut off, surrounded, waiting for orders that everyone knew meant death. Timoshenko's voice carried no emotion, just facts, just arithmetic. Comrades, the situation is as expected. We are encircled. Relief is not coming. Our mission now is to hold German forces here, prevent them from advancing on Moscow, buy maximum time for Stavka to prepare defenses. Breakout attempts will commence August 5th. Until then, we hold positions, conserve ammunition, survive. Acceptable casualties, 100%. Any questions? No one had questions. Questions required hope that answers might change something. This room contained no hope, only duty and mathematics, and the grim acceptance that came from knowing your death served a purpose larger than yourself. Gromov found you after the briefing, rifle slung over his shoulder, face thinner than it had been in June, eyes older. Lieutenant, we're trapped. Yes. Are we going to escape? The lie came automatic, necessary, merciful. Yes, Private, we're going to escape. He nodded, accepting it, and you wondered if he actually believed or if he was lying too. Both of you sustaining each other with false optimism because truth was too heavy to carry. That night, unable to sleep, you climbed to what remained of a fourth-floor apartment, found a gap in the rubble that offered a view west. German positions were visible. Campfires, vehicle lights, the distant sound of engines and voices. They surrounded you completely, a ring of steel and fire, tightening slowly, patient as death. But you'd accomplished the mission, 17 days. The briefing on July 10th had said 3 days. You'd given Stavka 14 extra days, 336 hours, 20,160 minutes, each one bought with blood. In Moscow, factories were evacuating. Siberian divisions were boarding trains. T-34s were rolling off assembly lines. The arithmetic was working. Your death would matter. Somewhere in the darkness, you heard tank engines, a different sound than German engines, deeper, heavier, T-34s. They were coming. The reinforcements Zhukov had promised, arriving too late to save Smolensk, but in time to save Moscow. And somewhere in those German lines, 30 kilometers west, a tank commander named Klaus Weber was writing a letter to his wife, telling her he'd be home for Christmas, believing the lie because belief was easier than truth. You'd meet him again. Not here, not now, but somewhere east, sometime soon, when the trap fully closed and the curse of Smolensk followed the Wehrmacht like a ghost that could never be outrun. The fires burned through the night. The siege continued. And in the east, winter was coming. July 29th, 1941. Aero 4:30 hours. Yelnya railway station, 30 kilometers east of Smolensk. Klaus Weber's watch read 4:30 when he heard the impossible sound. A train whistle, piercing and clear. Coming from the east where no trains should exist because every rail line had been cut, every locomotive destroyed, every junction point bombed into twisted metal and splintered ties. Guard duty at a captured railway station qualified as rest compared to urban warfare, which meant Weber and 12 other survivors from his decimated company stood perimeter, while the wounded slept in boxcars and the dead waited for burial details that never came. The station building was intact, surprisingly, brick walls pocked with bullet holes but standing, roof missing shingles but functional, platform empty except for shell casings and the detritus of hasty Soviet evacuation. The whistle came again, closer now, accompanied by a rhythmic chugging that grew louder with each second. Weber grabbed his binoculars, scanned the eastern horizon where dawn's first light was bleeding into the sky like a wound opening. Morning fog clung to the tracks, thick as wool. But through it he saw movement, shapes, the unmistakable silhouette of a locomotive. Herr Obergefreiter, there's a train coming. The voice belonged to Private Dieter Koch, 18 years old, conscripted in April, arrived at the front in June, already looked 40 from stress and malnutrition, and the persistent dysentery that had reduced half the company to hollow-eyed skeletons who shit blood and pretended everything was fine. Weber keyed his radio, reported to company command 3 kilometers west. Station guard to Hauptmann Steiner, train approaching from enemy territory, request instructions. Static, then Steiner's voice, hoarse from smoke inhalation during yesterday's building collapse. Impossible. All Soviet rolling stock was destroyed in the bombardment. You're hearing things. Sir, I'm looking at it. Armored locomotive, 12 flat cars moving at approximately 40 kilometers per hour. Pause, longer this time. Then, engage and destroy. Do not allow it to reach Smolensk pocket. Weber had 13 men, one MG-42 machine gun, and assorted rifles. The train had armor plating thick enough to deflect small arms fire and was moving too fast to effectively target. He ordered his men to fire anyway because orders were orders and disobedience meant court-martial, which meant execution, which meant dying without purpose instead of dying while following instructions, and German soldiers preferred the latter. The machine gun opened up first, tracer rounds arcing across 400 meters of morning mist, sparking off the locomotive's frontal armor like fireflies bouncing off a stone wall. Rifle fire joined in, 30 rounds per minute from 13 Kar 98K rifles, achieving nothing except noise and the illusion of resistance. The train didn't slow, didn't stop, didn't even acknowledge the attack except by existing, by continuing forward with mechanical indifference, by demonstrating that sometimes fate was a locomotive wrapped in steel plate and there was nothing you could do except watch it pass. As it roared through the station, close enough that Weber could have touched it if he'd been stupid enough to try, he saw the cargo. 12 flat cars, each carrying a tank. Not the light T-26s or obsolete T-28s that German intelligence had assured them comprised the bulk of Soviet armor. These were different, bigger, sloped armor that looked wrong, alien, like something from a future war that hadn't happened yet. Factory paint still fresh. No unit markings, straight from the Urals to the front, delivered by Armored Express while German forces stood and watched and understood, perhaps for the first time, that this war would not end in weeks. The train disappeared into the fog bank west, toward Smolensk, toward the pocket where 300,000 Soviets waited for rescue or death. The sound faded. The whistle blew once more, distant, triumphant, mocking. Weber lowered his rifle, hands shaking, not from fear but from understanding. The Soviets weren't cut off. The Germans were. Surrounded the enemy but couldn't seal the approaches, couldn't control the territory, couldn't stop a single armored train from delivering weapons that might change everything. Private Koch stood beside him, face pale in the growing light. "What were those tanks, Herr Obergefreiter?" "I don't know, but we're going to find out." 6:30 hours. Smolensk. Underground command bunker, 20 meters beneath what used to be a school and was now rubble with a basement. Dmitri Volkov hadn't slept in 38 hours when the alarm brought every officer to immediate assembly, stumbling down concrete stairs that smelled like urine and wet stone, and the sweat of 200 men living in a space designed for 50. Your battalion, started with 1,200 men on July 10th, currently numbered 347 effectives after 17 days of siege, was in reserve, which meant you weren't actively dying, just waiting for the next order that would resume the dying. Rest consisted of sitting against a wall, rifle across your lap, eyes closed, but mind churning through the arithmetic of survival. 347 men. 70% casualties was 840 deaths, which meant you'd already exceeded projections, were operating on borrowed time, statistical anomalies that should have been corpses, but kept breathing through sheer obstinacy. Marshal Timoshenko stood at the map table when you arrived, but he wasn't alone. Another officer occupied the space beside him, someone you'd never seen before, someone whose presence changed the atmosphere like pressure dropping before a storm. Physical presence, stocky, maybe 45, peasant's build, face that looked carved from Ural granite, eyes like frozen Volga in February. No decorations on his uniform except rank insignia, 4 stars, General, and a bearing that suggested decorations were irrelevant because everyone already knew who he was. Timoshenko gestured toward the newcomer, voice carrying the particular flatness of a man making introductions he'd rather not make. "Comrades, General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, Stavka representative. He arrives from Moscow with new orders." The room's temperature dropped 5 degrees. Zhukov's reputation preceded him like artillery barrage. Ruthless, brilliant, utterly indifferent to casualties if the arithmetic supported the strategy. Men who served under him either died heroically or lived to tell stories about the general who calculated human life like fuel consumption. Zhukov spoke without preamble, voice flat as a blade laid horizontal. I arrived from Moscow. Current situation: Germans believe you are defeated, surrounded, finished. You will prove them wrong. I bring 12 T-34 tanks, 4,000 rounds of 76mm ammunition, 8 tons of diesel, 200 volunteers from Kharkov Tank School. In return, I require 2 weeks. Can you give me 14 days? Silence. Every officer calculating, 70% casualties already sustained. Another 14 days meant everyone dies. No survivors, unit ceases to exist, except as a notation in casualty ledgers. You heard your voice before you decided to speak. Words bypassing thought and emerging fully formed like bullets from a rifle you didn't remember loading. We'll give you 16, Comrade General. Zhukov's gaze found you across the crowded basement, pinned you like an insect to corkboard. Name: Senior Lieutenant Dmitri Volkov, 154th Regiment, 16th Army. Volkov, if you survive, find me in Moscow. I'll make you major. Polite laughter from other officers, nervous energy seeking release through humor. But Zhukov wasn't joking. His face remained granite, expression unchanged, and you understood that promises from this man carried the weight of tactical necessity. If you survived 16 days, you were valuable enough to promote because survivors possess skills worth preserving. The briefing continued, tactical details, sector assignments, ammunition distribution. But your attention fragmented, caught on a single detail Zhukov had mentioned: 12 T-34 tanks. You'd heard rumors about the T-34, every soldier had. Whispered stories from survivors of border battles, intelligence reports smuggled from testing grounds. Myths that grew with each retelling until separating fact from propaganda became impossible. Supposedly invincible armor. Supposedly powerful gun. Supposedly the weapon that would turn the tide. Supposedly. After the briefing, as officers dispersed to their units, Zhukov intercepted you near the stairs. Volkov, you taught history? Yes, Comrade General. Kiev State University, 9 years before conscription. Then you understand logistics. Stalingrad wasn't won by Romans through superior tactics. It was won through superior supply lines over superior distance. What did you teach about Napoleon? That he took Moscow but lost Russia because he couldn't sustain his army through winter. Correct. Germans are Napoleon. We are winter, but winter requires time to arrive. Your job is to provide that time. 16 days, you promised. I'll hold you to that promise. He moved past you, climbing stairs toward the surface, leaving you with the weight of a promise you couldn't possibly keep and couldn't afford to break. July 30th, 1941. Dawn. Factory District, Eastern Smolensk. Klaus Weber's inherited tank, Panzer IV 217, formerly commanded by Lieutenant Schaefer until shrapnel through the throat rendered him former, advanced through morning mists that clung to ruined buildings like spectral shrouds. The company's remaining 4 operational panzers moved in column formation, 50-meter intervals, routine sweep of what intelligence assured them was the last pocket of organized resistance in this sector. 8 weeks into Operation Barbarossa, Weber had stopped believing intelligence reports. Intelligence said Moscow by August. Intelligence said minimal resistance. Intelligence said Russian morale was shattered, would collapse any day now. Intelligence was written by officers in comfortable headquarters who'd never heard a T-26 explode or seen Soviet soldiers charge machine guns with bayonets because they'd expended their last ammunition an hour ago and refused to stop fighting. The mist parted ahead, revealing the factory's shell. 3-story brick structure, roof collapsed, walls standing through architectural miracle or German oversight. Windows gaped empty, darkness visible beyond. Perfect ambush position that had probably already killed a dozen German scouts who'd thought the same thing Weber was thinking. Too obvious, too convenient, therefore safe. He was wrong. The shape emerged from the tree line 200 meters ahead, materializing like a nightmare achieving physical form. Tank. Soviet. But wrong somehow. Different from the T-26s and T-28s that constituted 90% of enemy armor encountered thus far. Bigger. sloped armor that deflected light instead of reflecting it, wide tracks that spread ground pressure, preventing the bogging that plagued German panzers in Russian mud. Long gun, 76 mm by the look of it, barrel elevated slightly as if the tank was breathing, alive, aware. Weber's gunner, Unteroffizier Hans Richter, 32, veteran of Poland and France, 3 tank kills to his credit, spoke first, voice carrying the particular uncertainty of a man confronting something outside his experience. "What is that?" "I don't know. Shoot it." Standard engagement procedure. Identify target, range, load appropriate ammunition, fire. Richter had done this 50 times, maybe 100. Muscle memory took over where thought hesitated. Target identified, 200 meters, loading armor piercing. The 50mm gun fired, recoil shuddering through the tank's chassis, cordite smoke filling the turret before ventilation fans cleared it. Through his periscope, Weber watched the tracer arc across morning mist, saw the impact, direct hit on the Soviet tank's turret, perfect shot, textbook precision. The round bounced, spark of impact, spray of paint chips, 50mm an armor-piercing shell deflecting upward at 45 degrees, tumbling through air, disappearing into fog bank beyond. What? The Soviet tank's turret rotated, smooth and mechanical, gun barrel tracking left, finding Weber's panzer with calm deliberation. No panic, no haste, just professional competence from a crew that knew their armor, made them invincible to everything Weber could throw at them. The 76mm gun fired. Time fragmented into discrete moments, each distinct, each eternal. The flash, the sound deeper than German guns, bass note that traveled through earth and steel and settled in your chest cavity like a second heartbeat. The impact, frontal armor, 50mm, insufficient against 76mm armor piercing at 200 meters. Penetration, the round punch through Panzer IV 217's glacis plate like needle through cloth, entered the crew compartment, found Richter sitting in the gunner's position, removed his head and upper torso, continued through the rear armor, exited, kept traveling. 4.2 seconds from impact to ammunition ignition. Weber counted them later, reconstructed the timeline from memory and trauma, and the peculiar clarity that comes from surviving when everyone else died. 1. Impact. Richter's body separating into component parts. Blood spray painting the turret interior. 2. Secondary impact as the penetrating round hit an ammunition rack. Didn't quite set it off, but cracked the casing. 3. Fuel fire starting in the engine compartment. Heat radiating forward through the firewall. 4. Ammunition cooking off, not exploding yet, but reaching critical temperature. 4.2. Weber's hands grabbed the turret hatch, wrenched it open, body moving on autonomous survival instinct while conscious mind struggled to process. He pulled himself through the hatch, rolled off the turret deck, hit ground, rolled again, kept rolling because the tank was a bomb now and distance was life. Behind him, Panzer IV 217 erupted, ammunition detonating, turret separating from hull, flames reaching 10 meters high, metal screaming as it tore itself apart, and somewhere in that conflagration was Richter's corpse, and the radio operator's corpse, and the driver's corpse, and the loader's corpse. 4 men who'd survived Poland and France and 6 weeks of Russia, erased in 4.2 seconds by a tank that shouldn't exist. Weber ran, didn't look back. Ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, and he collapsed behind rubble pile 300 meters from his burning panzer. Only then did he look back, see the smoke column rising, see the Soviet tank, that monster, that nightmare, reversing into tree line, withdrawing without pursuing because killing one German tank was sufficient, because their mission was delay, not destruction, because they understood the arithmetic better than he did. Hauptmann Steiner found him 20 minutes later, pulled him to his feet, checked for wounds, found none except the invisible ones. Weber, the tank, what happened? I don't know, sir. We hit it. Direct hit. Turret. The round bounced. Then it just... His voice failed. Language couldn't accommodate what he'd witnessed. Couldn't express the fundamental wrongness of watching your weapon fail, your training fail, Your understanding of military hierarchy fail. German tanks were superior. German tactics were superior. German soldiers were superior. That was doctrine. That was training. That was the foundation upon which the entire invasion rested. And it was wrong. All of it. Wrong. Steiner held up a piece of paper. Damage assessment from the battalion's reconnaissance section, delivered by runner 5 minutes ago. 5 Panzers engaged Soviet heavy tanks this morning. 5 destroyed. 0 Soviet losses confirmed. Wehrmacht High Command is calling them T-34s. New design, sloped armor, effective thickness 90 millimeters, 76 mm gun, speed 35 kilometers per hour, weight 28 tons. He crumpled the paper, threw it into a puddle of oil and rainwater. We're not hunters anymore, Weber. We're prey. Inside the T-34, 200 meters away, behind tree line that concealed their withdrawal, Captain Dmitri Volkov removed his leather tanker's helmet, wiped sweat from his forehead, allowed himself 10 seconds of satisfaction before returning to professional assessment. Your transition from infantry to armor had occurred yesterday, July 29th, when Zhukov's reinforcements arrived and revealed they needed experienced officers more than they needed tank-trained crews. The logic was brutal but sound. Better to have combat veterans learning tank operations than tank school graduates learning combat. Combat couldn't be taught. Tank operations could. Your crew assigned yesterday, trained today. Driver, Sergeant Mikhail Kulikov, 31, professional tanker since 1936, survived Khalkhin Gol against Japanese in 39, face scarred from burns, hands steady. Gunner, Private Alexei Gromov. Yes, that Gromov, promoted from rifleman to gunner because he had good eyes and steady nerves, and you trusted him to not panic when German rounds started bouncing off your armor like hailstones off cathedral domes. Loader, Private Nikolai Lebedev, 20, factory worker from Kharkov, volunteered when his factory evacuated east, chose fighting over fleeing, strong enough to manhandle 76mm shells all day without tiring. Commander, you, learning on the job, discovering that tank combat was chess played at 50 kilometers per hour with pieces that exploded when captured. Gromov's voice came through the intercom, excited, young, alive in a way that infantry combat had nearly extinguished. Comrade Captain, did you see? Direct hit, they bounced. I saw. Don't get confident. They'll bring heavier guns. 88mm anti-aircraft guns can penetrate our armor. Stay alert. Kulikov, driving, spoke without taking his eyes off the terrain ahead. Sir, where to? Back to assembly area. Rearm, refuel. We've accomplished today's mission, which was, make them afraid. The T-34 rumbled through forest trails too narrow for German tanks, but perfect for Soviet armor, demonstrating the advantage of fighting on home territory where every trail was mapped. Every ford was known. Every hiding place had been used by someone's grandfather during the Civil War, or someone's great-grandfather during Napoleon's retreat. Back at the assembly area, concealed beneath camouflage netting in a ravine 3 kilometers northeast of the factory, you dismounted, stretched muscles that had cramped from 2 hours in the commander's cupola, assessed the day's work. Mission, demonstrate T-34 superiority, destroy 1 German tank, withdraw before they could organize response. Success rate, 100%. Cost, 0. Acceptable arithmetic. But the satisfaction was hollow because you just killed 4 men, 4 soldiers who were somebody's son or brother or father, 4 Germans who woke up this morning expecting to live and were now charcoal and bone fragments scattered across a factory yard. You'd killed men before. Infantry combat was killing, but tank combat was different, impersonal, mechanical, reducing human beings to targets measured in meters and millimeters. Crew served weapons that happened to be manned by living tissue that bled and burned when armor failed. The German tank commander had escaped. You'd watched him bail out, roll off the turret, run. You could have fired, killed him, but chose not to because killing fleeing men violated some internal code you couldn't articulate, some line between soldier and murderer that you needed to preserve to remain human. Gromov climbed out of the gunner's hatch, grinning, still riding adrenaline high. Captain, When do we attack again? Tomorrow? Or tonight? Whenever they give us targets. I want to get 10 German tanks. That's my goal. 20 years old, treating war like sport, collecting kills like trophies. You remembered being that young, that naive, that convinced of your own immortality. It was last month. It felt like a previous lifetime. Gromov, each tank you destroy contains 4 or 5 men. Men with families, homes, people who love them. Don't forget that. His grin faded slightly, not quite understanding, but trying. But they're fascists, sir. They're fascists, and they're men. Both things are true simultaneously. Remember that when you're aiming. August 3rd, 1941. 6 days after the pocket closed. 13 days after the siege began. German intelligence reports. Weber overheard them at company headquarters while delivering a damage assessment, grew increasingly baffled, frustrated, tinged with panic that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Day 6 of encirclement. Enemy should be out of food. Enemy launched 3 counterattacks today. Day 7. Enemy should be out of ammunition. Enemy artillery barrage lasted 4 hours. Day 10. Enemy should be surrendering en masse. Enemy expanded perimeter 2 kilometers in northern sector. Hauptmann Steiner, studying the reports with expressions suggesting he was reading his own death sentence, finally articulated what everyone was thinking. How? How are they resupplying? We control every road, every rail line, every approach. Where are they getting food, ammunition, fuel? The answer arrived 2 nights later when Weber's guard detail spotted aircraft, ancient PO-2 biplanes, wood and canvas, flying so low and slow that anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress enough to target them. The biplanes dropped supply canisters attached to parachutes, each canister containing ammunition, medicine, food, the basic necessities of continued resistance. But that wasn't the primary resupply route. The primary route was walking. August 5th, 0200 hours. German listening post 3 kilometers north of Smolensk reported movement in the swamps. Lots of movement, hundreds of people, maybe thousands, moving through marshland that German maps labeled impassable. Civilians, old men, women, teenagers, each carrying 20-kilogram packs loaded with supplies. Walking 40 kilometers through chest-deep water, through mosquito clouds thick enough to suffocate, through darkness relieved only by starlight, delivering supplies to soldiers who continued fighting because the supplies continued arriving. One old woman, captured when she wandered into German lines by accident, disoriented from exhaustion, was interrogated by intelligence officers who couldn't believe her story. You walked 40 kilometers through a swamp? At your age? She was maybe 60, maybe 70, skin weathered, hands calloused, eyes containing depths of contempt that made the intelligence officer uncomfortable. My son is in there. He fights so Russia lives. I walk so he fights. What do you do, German boy? You sit in your safe headquarters and ask stupid questions. They released her because holding her required resources and she wasn't a military threat. She walked back into the swamp, disappeared, probably died of exhaustion before reaching Soviet lines. Probably nobody followed to check. August 5th, 0600 hours. Soviet command bunker. Captain Dmitri Volkov, promoted yesterday from senior lieutenant. The promotion came with 4 additional stars on your collar tabs and exactly 0 additional pay or privileges. Received orders that qualified as suicide dressed in tactical language. Timoshenko stood at the map, Zhukov beside him, both faces showing the particular exhaustion of men who'd stopped sleeping because sleep was time, and time was the only currency that mattered. Captain Volkov, your battalion will conduct diversionary attack northwest sector, objective German supply depot at Yarsevo. Mission duration, 8 hours. Expected survival rate, 20%. Numbers translated to 400 men attacking, 80 surviving. Your battalion's current strength was 400. Simple arithmetic. Purpose, Comrade Marshal? Zhukov answered, voice carrying no emotion, just tactical necessity. While Germans focus on your attack, 50,000 men withdraw through eastern marshes. You are the distraction. They are the priority. Acceptable? Acceptable. The word did heavy lifting, carrying weight of 400 lives expended to save 50,000. The same arithmetic that had governed this entire operation. The mathematics of sacrifice that made sense on paper and felt like murder when implemented. Yes, Comrade General. Good. You have 18 hours to prepare. Attack commences midnight, August 6th. Commissar Petrov will accompany you. The commissar stepped forward from shadows where he'd been standing, unnoticed until Zhukov's mention. Anatoly Petrov, 42 political officer, party member since 1924, face showing nothing, eyes showing everything. Doubt, exhaustion, the particular weariness of true believers who lost faith but kept performing rituals because ritual was all that remained. After the briefing, you found Petrov outside the bunker, smoking a cigarette he'd acquired through the mysterious networks that supplied commissars with luxuries ordinary soldiers couldn't imagine. Commissar, he turned, offered the cigarette. You accepted, dragged deep, tasted Turkish tobacco and the bitter knowledge of shared mortality. Captain Volkov, you think I'm here to shoot deserters and spout propaganda. The thought occurred. I am, that's my function. But between us, between men who know they're dead, I stopped believing in 1937, the purges. I denounced my commander to save myself. He was innocent. They shot him anyway. I got promoted. That's when I understood. The party eats itself and calls it justice. Then why continue? Because if I don't, someone else does. And maybe I'm slightly less ruthless than my replacement would be. Arithmetic, Captain. Always arithmetic. Your death tomorrow saves 50,000. My continued service maybe saves 50 from execution for cowardice. Small numbers, but numbers. You returned the cigarette, watched smoke curl into night air, wondered if death would hurt or if you'd simply stop existing between one moment and the next. Consciousness extinguished like candle flame. See you at midnight, Commissar. See you in hell, Captain. August 6th, 001 hours. The attack began exactly on schedule. 400 men, 200 with Mosin Nagant rifles, 90 rounds each. 100 with PPSH-41 submachine guns, 200 rounds each. 50 with DP-27 machine guns, 500 rounds each. 30 sappers carrying explosives. 20 tank crew operating 2 T-34s. Support elements, officers, medics, bringing the total to 400. Objective: German supply depot at Yartsevo, 12 kilometers northwest. Intelligence reported 30 trucks, ammunition stockpiles, fuel dump. Destroying it would disrupt German logistics for 72 hours. But disruption wasn't the point. The point was distraction. The point was making Germans look northwest while 50,000 men escaped southeast through swamps that Germans believed were impassable. You led from the front because officers who led from the rear got fragged by their own men when the shooting started, advanced through wheat fields, grain waist high, providing concealment until German flares went up at 0430 hours and turned night into day, bright enough to count individual soldiers at 400 meters. Machine guns opened fire. MG-42s, 1,200 rounds per minute, sound like ripping canvas, tracers drawing red lines through wheat field, cutting men down in swaths, mathematical precision applied to human flesh. Your first wave, 80 men, lost 30 in the first minute. The survivors kept advancing because retreat meant dying slowly instead of dying quickly, and both options ended in death, so forward momentum at least created illusion of purpose. Grumov's T-34 provided fire support, high explosive rounds detonating in German trenches. But one tank against prepared positions was gesture, not solution. The second T-34 took an anti-tank round at 0445 hours, brewed up. Crew bailed out except the gunner who died in the turret when ammunition cooked off. You reached German trenches at 500 hours with 40 men remaining from your 80-man lead element. Hand-to-hand combat, bayonets and entrenching tools and fists. Germans fighting with desperation of men who understood that losing a supply depot meant starving. Soviets fighting with desperation of men who understood they were already dead. Commissar Petrov fought like demon, Tokarev pistol in each hand, shooting Germans at point-blank range. 3 rounds left, 2, 1, empty, then using pistols as clubs, smashing skulls, roaring like bear, blood covering his uniform. His blood, German blood, impossible to distinguish. A German rifle shot hit him, stomach, intestines visible through torn uniform. He kept fighting. Shot another German, then another, then collapsed, still conscious, still trying to reload empty pistols with hands that couldn't grip anymore. You knelt beside him, combat continuing around you, bullets snapping past close enough to hear their passage. "Commissar, I'll get you evacuated." "No, leave me. Get to the depot." Blood spreading across his uniform, pooling beneath him. Too much blood. Arterial bleeding that couldn't be stopped without surgery, and surgeons were 12 kilometers away. "Comrade Commissar?" "Did we win, Captain?" You looked at the battlefield, at German trenches overrun, at the supply depot burning in the distance, sappers having placed charges while you provided distraction. "Yes, Comrade Commissar. Great victory." He smiled, teeth red with blood. "Liar, but thank you for lying." He died. You closed his eyes, took his party card from his pocket, would deliver it to appropriate authorities if you survived, which you wouldn't. But procedure was procedure, even when procedure was meaningless. The depot burned. Mission accomplished. Cost: 400 men committed, 147 survived. 63% casualties in 6 hours. Worse than projected, but still within acceptable parameters. As you withdrew eastward, carrying wounded, leaving dead, you heard aircraft overhead, 60-plus planes, German, flying east then banking south. Luftwaffe redeploying from Smolensk sector to support Kiev offensive, which meant the distraction had worked, which meant 50,000 men were escaping while Germans chased phantoms northwest and redeployed air assets south, which meant Petrov's death and 253 others' deaths had purchased something tangible. Time for 50,000 soldiers to fight another day, to retreat to Moscow, to defend the capital when winter came. Acceptable arithmetic. But arithmetic didn't stop you from seeing Petrov's face every time you closed your eyes. August 12, 1941. 1500 hours. Abandoned village, 8 kilometers north of Smolensk. The village had no name on Weber's map, just a dot indicating settlement. Probably 50 people in peacetime. Now 0 people because civilians had fled, and soldiers had learned that villages made excellent ambush points, and excellent ambush points made excellent burial grounds. Weber's patrol, 8 men including him, 1 Panzer III, swept the village on routine reconnaissance, checking for Soviet positions, partisans, anything that might threaten the supply convoys that sustained German forces besieging the Smolensk pocket. You entered from opposite ends of the same street. Pure coincidence. Bad luck. Fate demonstrating its sense of ironic timing. Weber's patrol. 8 Germans, 1 tank. South end of village. Your team. 6 Soviets, including you. Northeast end of village. Both sides spotted each other simultaneously, maybe 3 seconds to react before someone started shooting, and reaction time determined who died first. You chose ambush. Soviet doctrine: when outnumbered, attack from concealment. Your team took positions in houses flanking the street. 2 men per house, overlapping fields of fire, tank positioned to block retreat. Weber chose caution, German doctrine: when uncertain, halt and assess. His patrol stopped, tank reversed, infantry took cover behind stone walls that lined the street. Standoff, 60 meters separating the forces, close enough to throw grenades but too far for accuracy, close enough to hit with rifles. But stone walls provided adequate cover, close enough to see faces, but too far to distinguish features. Then the fire started. Nobody knew which side fired the tracer round that ignited the thatched roof. Didn't matter. Fire didn't care about attribution. The roof caught, flames spreading with terrifying speed through summer-dry thatch, jumping from one building to next, wind pushing fire south, then shifting east, then back south, unpredictable, hungry, consuming the village with indiscriminate appetite. Within 5 minutes, both sides were trapped. German positions on south end blocked by fire, Soviet positions on north end blocked by fire. Only escape, east, through open wheat field, no cover, mutual suicide if shooting continued. Weber made the decision, shouted in German across 60 meters of burning village. "Ruskies! The house is burning! Ceasefire!" You didn't speak German. The words were noise, but tone carried meaning, urgency, proposal, desperation. Weber tried Russian, Terrible Russian learned from interrogating prisoners. Accent so thick it was almost incomprehensible. Ogon, Paramiria! Fire, truce. You understood. Didn't trust it, didn't believe it, but understood that staying meant burning and leaving meant risking German fire. And fire was certain death, while bullets were only probable death. We withdraw east, you withdraw south, count to 100. Weber's response came immediate, grateful, equally desperate. Agreed. No shooting! Both sides emerged simultaneously, rifles carried but not aimed, fingers on triggers but not squeezing, every man calculating odds, measuring distances, preparing to dive for cover if someone panicked and fired. You saw him. The German tank commander, binoculars around neck, Bavarian accent even through broken Russian, age maybe late 20s, face showing exhaustion and something else. Recognition. He saw you. Soviet officer, Captain Stars, rifle slung across back, same exhaustion, same recognition. You. The ambush near Slutsk in June. The Soviet who chose not to shoot. The German who lived because of that choice. 60 days ago, different lifetimes, same war. 60 meters separated you. Long range for pistols, medium range for rifles, point-blank range for the certainty that shooting him meant dying, because his men would shoot you, and your men would shoot them, and everyone would die in a village whose name didn't exist on maps. Gromov, standing beside you, whispered urgently, "Comrade Captain, we should stand down." Weber spoke, Russian, terrible, but comprehensible. You, good soldier. Fight. Good. You had no German, used gestures instead. Pointed at him, pointed at burning village, shrugged. War is madness. The gesture conveyed more than words. Weber nodded, understanding passing between you without language. Two soldiers recognizing shared humanity, despite opposing uniforms. Go, count to 100. Da, count to 100. Both forces withdrew, walking backwards for the first 50 meters, maintaining visual contact, ensuring nobody fired. Then turning and running when distance made ambush impossible. At 100 meters, you looked back. Weber looked back. Eye contact, 3 seconds, acknowledgement that this truce was temporary, circumstantial, wouldn't extend beyond this burning village. Next time you met, one of you would die. But today, both lived. Your team reached Soviet lines without incident, reported the patrol encounter as routine. No mention of the truce because truces implied fraternization, which implied disloyalty, which implied execution. That night, sleepless, you wrote in your journal, the only personal entry you'd made since the war began. August 12th, 1941. Met a German today. Not a monster, just a man. War makes us enemies, but we're not different. I wonder if he has children. I wonder if he'll survive. I wonder if I will. Tomorrow we attempt breakout. Timoshenko says 50,000 men will escape through eastern swamps. I believe him because I must, but I think of the German soldier. He fights for his home as I fight for mine. Only one of us is right, but both of us will bleed. August 13th, 0200 hours. Smolensk eastern perimeter. The breakout began in darkness. 50,000 men moving through swamps that German maps labeled impassable, which meant Germans wouldn't guard them, which meant impassable was relative term depending on how much you were willing to suffer. Your battalion, 147 survivors from the Yarsevo attack, drew rearguard duty, which meant holding western defenses while main force escaped east, which meant dying slowly enough that Germans didn't realize the pocket was emptying until too late. Orders were specific, hold 48 hours minimum. Fight until ammunition exhausted, then withdraw to secondary positions, then tertiary, then surrender or die, whichever came first. German assault began at dawn, methodical, overwhelming, professional. Artillery preparation, infantry advance, tank support, combined arms doctrine executed with mechanical precision. They had numbers, firepower, air support, everything except time. Your defense was improvisation elevated to art form. Mobile positions, hit and withdraw, never holding ground longer than necessary to inflict casualties. German advance averaged 200 meters per hour, purchasing each meter with blood and time, and the growing realization that something was wrong. By evening August 14th, your 147 had become 40. Gromov survived, shoulder wound from shrapnel but still fighting. Kulikov survived. Burns from tank fire but still driving. Lebedev survived, concussion from artillery near miss but still loading shells. Aero 600 hours August 15th. Radio message from headquarters, encrypted, brief. Main force clear. Withdraw immediately. 40 men, 18 kilometers to safety, Germans pursuing. You ran. The swamp crossing took 8 hours. Water chest deep, mud pulling boots off, mosquitoes thick enough to breathe. Lost 3 men to drowning, 2 to exhaustion. Mercy killed because carrying them was impossible, and leaving them alive for Germans meant torture. 35 survivors reached Soviet lines at 1800 hours August 15th. You collapsed, physically incapable of another step. Body shutting down after 60 days of continuous combat on inadequate rations and interrupted sleep, and the particular exhaustion that comes from being terrified every moment of every day. Someone gave you water. Someone gave you bread. Someone told you the breakout had succeeded. 50,000 men escaped, German encirclement broken, Smolensk pocket eliminated as tactical threat, but German advance delayed by 5 weeks total. 5 weeks, July 10th to August 15th. 36 days. Zhukov had asked for 14 days. You'd given him 36. Acceptable arithmetic. Except it didn't feel acceptable when you counted the cost. Battalion of 1,200 reduced to 35, 97% casualties. Statistical annihilation. But somewhere in Moscow, factories were producing T-34s. Somewhere in Siberia, divisions were boarding trains. Somewhere on the approaches to the capital, engineers were digging tank traps and stringing barbed wire and preparing defenses that wouldn't exist without those 36 days. Gromov found you after midnight, after the medics had treated your wounds, and the quartermasters had issued new uniforms to replace ones that were more holes than fabric. Captain, we did it. We held. We held. What happens now? Now comes Moscow. Now comes winter. Now comes the part where we discover if this was worth it. He nodded, young face showing age that hadn't been there in July. 19-year-old who'd become veteran, survived against arithmetic, earned the right to cynicism that sustained survivors when optimism failed. That night, 300 kilometers west, Klaus Weber received orders that changed everything. 2nd Panzer Group redeploying south to Kiev. Moscow offensive postponed indefinitely. All units departing Smolensk sector within 48 hours. He wrote his final letter to Anna, the one he'd actually mail, the one that expressed truths he'd been avoiding since June. Dearest Anna, we won at Smolensk. The radio says so. The officers say so. Everyone says so. So why do I feel like we lost something irreplaceable? Why do I dream of burning villages and men's faces pressed against tank visors and Russian officers who let me live when they could have killed me? We're marching to Kiev now. They say it's strategic necessity. I think it's because we can't take Moscow anymore. We spent too long at Smolensk. The summer is ending. Winter is coming. And I'm afraid, Anna. For the first time since this began, I'm truly afraid. He mailed the letter. It would arrive in Munich 3 weeks later. Anna would read it and cry and show it to Greta, who wouldn't understand why Papa was sad. 6 months later, Weber would be dead, frozen outside Moscow, another statistic in the arithmetic of acceptable losses. But on August 15th, 1941, driving south toward Kiev, watching Smolensk disappear in his Panzer's rearview mirrors, he was alive and afraid and correct in his fear. Smolensk hadn't been a battle. It had been a curse, and the curse was following them. August 21st, 1941, Führer Headquarters, Rastenburg, East Prussia. The document arrived at Klaus Weber's company headquarters 3 hours after it was drafted, transmitted by radio telegraph, decoded by signals officers who understood the words but not their implications, distributed to company commanders who read them twice because the first reading suggested hallucination or forgery. Wehrmacht High Command Directive 34, signed by Adolf Hitler himself, countersigned by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, authenticated with stamps and codes that confirmed authenticity even as content defied tactical sense. Weber read it standing in what remained of a commandeered farmhouse 6 kilometers south of Smolensk. Rain drumming on the roofs, surviving tin panels, water dripping through holes where Soviet artillery had ventilated the structure during some forgotten engagement. Army Group Center offensive toward Moscow will be postponed until further notice. 2nd Panzer Group under General Guderian will redeploy south to support Kiev encirclement. 3rd Panzer Group under General Hoth will redeploy north to support Leningrad offensive. Remaining Army Group Center forces will hold current positions, consolidate gains, prepare for renewed Moscow offensive upon completion of Kiev and Leningrad operations. Effective immediately, no exceptions. Heil Hitler. Hauptmann Steiner read over Weber's shoulder, breathing through his mouth because German dentistry hadn't caught up to him and infected teeth made nose breathing painful. We're leaving. We won. The pocket collapsed 2 weeks ago. Moscow is 400 kilometers away. Why are we? His voice trailed into silence because answers didn't exist. Only orders, and questioning orders meant courts-martial, which meant execution, which meant dying without purpose instead of dying while following instructions. Weber's company, what remained of it after Smolensk consumed 70% of their strength, would redeploy south within 48 hours. Destination: Ukraine. Objective: encircle Soviet forces defending Kiev. Strategic value: grain production, industrial capacity, psychological blow to Soviet morale. Strategic cost: 6 weeks minimum, probably 8, possibly 10. 6 weeks during which Moscow would remain unthreatened, unattacked, allowed to breathe and build and prepare. The mathematics didn't work. Any soldier who'd studied basic logistics understood that Moscow was the objective, the prize, the strategic center whose capture would decapitate Soviet command structure and possibly collapse organized resistance west of the Urals. Kiev was secondary, tertiary, something to capture after Moscow fell, or ignore entirely if Moscow fell quickly enough. But Hitler had decided otherwise, and Hitler's decisions carried the weight of divine proclamation in a state that had replaced God with the Führer and faith with obedience. Their August 22, 1941, the redeployment began. 2nd Panzer Group, Guderian's mechanized force that had spearheaded the drive to Smolensk, turned 90 degrees right and marched south. 400 kilometers from current positions to Kiev sector. Should have required 4 days at standard march rate. Required 12 because Russian roads weren't roads so much as suggestions of where roads might exist if civil engineering had ever reached this far east. Weber's inherited panzer. He'd stopped learning their numbers, stopped naming them. Tanks died faster than crews and attachment was psychological liability. Broke down on day 3 near Gomel, transmission failure, parts unavailable, repair impossible. The tank was destroyed by its own engineers. Thermite grenades melting the engine block into slag, preventing Soviet recovery and conversion. Weber watched his 4th tank die, no, 5th, he'd lost count, and felt nothing. Tanks were tools. Tools broke. New tools were issued or you became infantry, whichever logistics determined. He was reassigned to Panzer IV, Go 118, older model, worn treads, oil consumption suggesting piston ring failure, but functional enough for government work, which meant functional enough to drive south until it broke or burned. The column stretched for kilometers, vehicles nose to tail, raising dust clouds visible for 50 kilometers, advertising German movements to any Soviet with eyes and imagination. Luftwaffe air cover was sporadic. Aircraft redeploying to support Kiev meant fewer aircraft protecting convoys, meant vulnerability to Soviet ground attack aircraft that appeared like wolves testing wounded prey. Food was rationed, fuel was rationed. Everything was rationed except exhaustion and doubt, both of which arrived in unlimited supply. August 25th, rare rest day, convoy halted for mechanical repairs that couldn't be performed while moving. Weber sat beneath his tank's shadow, writing on paper scavenged from abandoned Soviet offices, pen borrowed from the company clerk who'd survived Smolensk through the simple expedient of never leaving headquarters. Dearest Anna and little Greta, I write this from Ukraine. Though we're already receiving orders to march back north toward Moscow after Kiev falls, they say Kiev will fall quickly, another great encirclement, 600,000 Soviets trapped. The largest victory in history, they say. So why does it feel like defeat? The letter continued, words spilling faster than thought could organize them. Confession dressed as correspondence. Truths he'd been suppressing since June, erupting like infection lanced by surgeon's blade. Anna, remember when I left in May? I told you I'd be home by Christmas. I believed it. We all did. Russia was supposed to collapse like France, like Poland. But Russia doesn't collapse. It retreats and retreats and retreats. And every kilometer we advance, we get weaker. At Smolensk, I met a Russian soldier. We were enemies. But for 100 seconds, we had a truce. He let me live. I let him live. I've thought about him every day since. Was he at Kiev? Did he die at Smolensk? I'll never know. But I know this. He fought for his home as I fight for mine. The difference is, his home is here. Mine is 2,000 kilometers west. Every day we march east, I'm farther from you. Every day he retreats east, he's closer to reinforcements. The pen moved without conscious guidance, muscle memory translating thought to ink, creating permanent record of impermanent man approaching his extinction. The veterans don't talk about victory anymore. We talk about surviving winter. The new boys still believe we'll win. I hope they're right, but I've seen too much. Greta, if you ever read this, and I pray you never do, because that means I came home and told you myself. Remember, your papa wasn't a hero. He was just a man who wanted to come home. The real heroes are the ones who never made it back. Anna, if I don't return, and I think I won't, please tell Greta I loved her. Tell her I fought because I had to, not because I wanted to. Tell her war isn't glorious. It's mud and blood, and men dying for reasons they don't understand. He paused, pen hovering above paper, considering whether to continue, whether confession served purpose or merely indulged weakness. Decided confession was luxury he couldn't afford. Folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope scavenged from the same Soviet office that provided paper, addressed it carefully because mail service was chaos, and careful addressing improved odds that Anna would receive it before telegram announcing his death. I've killed men at Smolensk, maybe 20, maybe 50. I'll never know exact number. Their faces haunt me. But the face I see most clearly is the Russian officer who let me live. I wonder if he remembers me. I wonder if he's still alive. There's a saying here now among the veterans. Smolensk taught us that Russia bleeds, but we bleed faster. It's true. Every victory costs more than the last, and Moscow is still 400 kilometers away. The letter concluded with formalities. Love declarations, hopes for reunion, requests to kiss Greta goodnight, and Weber sealed it, gave it to the company clerk for inclusion in the next mail shipment west. The letter would arrive in Munich on September 18th. Anna would read it and cry and understand that her husband was already dead, just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The August 18th, 1941, Moscow, field hospital converted from a textile factory, machines replaced by beds, looms replaced by operating tables, production shifted from cloth to survival. Captain Dmitri Volkov lay in a bed that smelled like carbolic acid and old blood, staring at ceiling beams that still showed scorch marks from a fire nobody had bothered explaining. Your body was inventory of damage. Shrapnel wounds in left thigh and right shoulder, malnutrition sufficient to count ribs through skin, dysentery that had reduced you to skeletal architecture animated by spite. The doctor, elderly woman, maybe 60, recalled from retirement when younger doctors went to the front, examined your wounds with hands that had performed 10,000 similar examinations, pattern recognition replacing individual attention. You'll live, Captain. The wounds are infected but not gangrenous. 2 weeks rest, proper food, you'll be functional. When can I return to duty? 2 weeks minimum, 4 weeks recommended, 6 weeks if you want to actually recover instead of just surviving long enough to die properly at the front. 2 weeks. She sighed, made a notation on the chart hanging at your bed's foot. Move to the next patient without argument, because arguing with soldiers about returning to combat was like arguing with the tide about coming in. 2 weeks became 3 because infection persisted despite sulfa drugs and optimistic prognoses. 3 weeks became 4 because the shrapnel in your shoulder required surgical extraction when it began migrating toward major blood vessels. September 10th, 1941. You were discharged with orders to report to Mozhesk defensive line, 120 kilometers west of Moscow, where fresh units were assembling for the defense that everyone knew was coming, but nobody wanted to discuss. Before departing Moscow, you visited Stavka headquarters, not because you had business there, but because Zhukov had said, "Find me in Moscow if you survived," and you'd survived and wondered if the promise was real or just tactical encouragement delivered to a man expected to die. The headquarters occupied a former luxury hotel, grandeur undermined by sandbags and barbed wire, and anti-aircraft guns on the roof. You showed your orders to sentries who checked them against lists and made telephone calls before allowing entry. Zhukov's office was on the third floor, corner room with windows overlooking Kremlin walls visible 3 blocks away. He sat behind a desk covered in maps and reports and tea glasses that had been full hours ago and were now just sticky residue. He looked up when you entered, face showing no recognition. Then something clicked and memory engaged. "Volkov, Smolensk? You gave me 16 days. 36, Comrade General." "Yes, 36. Exceeded projections significantly. Your battalion, I read the casualty reports, 97% losses, 35 survivors from 1,200. You understand what that means?" "That we accomplished the mission, Comrade General." "It means you're valuable. Men who survive 97% casualties possess skills worth preserving. I'm assigning you to training command. New conscripts need officers who understand how Germans fight, how to delay them, how to die slowly enough to matter." The assignment was logical, sensible, maximized your utility to the war effort. It was also punishment disguised as reward, condemning you to watch untrained boys march toward their deaths while you remained alive, safe, complicit in their sacrifice. "I'd prefer combat assignment, Comrade General." "Preference noted and rejected. You'll report to Mozhesk, take command of 234th Training Regiment. Prepare them for defense of Moscow." "That's an order, Major Volkov." "Major." The promotion came attached to the assignment. Battlefield commission confirmed by Stavka authority. 4 stars on your collar tabs replaced by 3. Soviet rank insignia operated inverse to logic. Fewer stars meant higher rank. "Yes, Comrade General." You saluted, departed, descended stairs that felt steeper than when you'd climbed them, emerged into Moscow streets that bustled with activity. Civilians digging trenches, soldiers marching to assembly points, trucks carrying supplies east in case evacuation became necessary. The city smelled like autumn approaching, leaves turning, first cold edge entering morning air, warning that winter was coming, and winter didn't care about German timetables or Hitler's strategies or the mathematics of acceptable losses. Or September 10th, 1941. Smolensk. The city had stopped burning 3 weeks ago, fires extinguished by autumn rains that turned rubble into mud and streets into canals. German occupation forces, 40,000 men tasked with controlling a city that once held 160,000 civilians, plus military garrison, established headquarters in the least damaged buildings and tried to pretend they governed something other than ruins. Civilian population, 20,000, maybe less, mostly elderly and children. Anyone capable of fighting or fleeing had done so. They emerged from basements like survivors of plague, hollow-eyed, skeletal, speaking in whispers because loud voices attracted attention, and attention from occupiers meant death or deportation or rape, depending on which soldier you encountered. The counting began on September 11th. German efficiency applied to quantifying destruction. Casualty assessment, Smolensk operation, July 10th, September 10th, 1941. Soviet losses. 300,000 killed, wounded, captured. 70% of defending force. Acceptable according to their mathematics, catastrophic by any human measure. German losses. 250,000 killed, wounded. 25% of attacking force. Unacceptable by German doctrine, which required 3-to-1 advantage in urban combat and had achieved 1-to-1 attrition. Infrastructure damage. 70% of buildings destroyed or severely damaged. All bridges collapsed. Rail yards obliterated. Water systems compromised. Electrical grid non-existent. Medieval walls breached in 47 locations. Assumption Cathedral's dome collapsed, cross melted, foundation cracked. Civilian casualties. 40,000 confirmed dead, 100,000 displaced, fate unknown. Mass graves, 87 identified, contents estimated at 15,000 bodies, mostly military but civilian remains mixed throughout. Identification impossible. Burial performed by German engineers using bulldozers because individual burials would require months. The German officer assigned to compile the report, Major Friedrich Becker, 42, career administrator, transferred from Warsaw where his talents for organization proved valuable, concluded his assessment with observation that deviated from standard military language. Strategic outcome remains unclear. City captured at enormous cost. Enemy forces withdrew in good order rather than surrendering. Moscow offensive delayed minimum 6 weeks, possibly longer depending on logistics and weather. Tactical victory achieved. Strategic value questionable. The report was filed, forwarded to Army Group Center headquarters, read by officers who'd already reached similar conclusions, archived in files that would burn when Germany collapsed 4 years later. Becker walked Smolensk's streets after submitting his report, trying to understand how a city could be won and feel like defeat. Past buildings reduced to facades, walls standing but nothing behind them, windows empty as eye sockets and skulls. Past civilians who looked at him with expressions combining fear and contempt and exhausted acceptance. Past the cathedral ruins where Orthodox priests still conducted services despite collapsed dome. Standing in courtyard, speaking to congregation of 30 believers who knelt on rubble and prayed to God who'd allowed this to happen or couldn't prevent it. Either interpretation suggesting divine impotence or divine malice. The priest saw Becker watching, approached without fear, because fear required energy, and the priest had none remaining. German officer, you won. Congratulations. Was it worth it? Becker had no answer. Walked away, returned to headquarters, requested transfer to rear area logistics because administering ruins was task he lacked stomach for. His transfer was denied because administrators were scarce and ruins required administration, and Germany didn't care about officers' preferences, only their utility. September 15, 1941. Kiev. The encirclement closed on September 16th, one day after Weber's company arrived in sector. Assigned perimeter guard duty preventing Soviet breakout attempts. 600,000 Soviet soldiers trapped. Largest encirclement in military history, larger than Cannae, where Hannibal destroyed Roman legions, larger than any battle in human record. German radio proclaimed triumph. Goebbels' propaganda ministry distributed newsreels showing endless columns of Soviet prisoners marching west. Demoralized, defeated, proof that the war was won and victory was inevitable. Weber stood guard duty over prisoner column on September 18th, watching 40,000 men shuffle past in formations that had ceased being military and become migration, exodus, defeated army becoming refugee stream. The Soviet officer walked near the column's center, captain's stars still visible on collar tabs despite dirt and blood. Face showing nothing, eyes showing everything. Exhaustion, defeat, the particular emptiness of men who'd fought until ammunition ran out, and then fought with bayonets until strength ran out, and then surrendered because surrendering was only option remaining. Weber watched him pass, this anonymous captain who could have been the man from Smolensk or could have been anyone. 600,000 Soviets all looked the same after they'd marched 40 kilometers without food or water. The officer looked at Weber, direct eye contact, 3 seconds of mutual recognition that transcended language and uniform and the arbitrary divisions that made them enemies. Then he was passed, swallowed by the column, disappeared into massive humanity, moving west toward prison camps where half would die during winter, and the survivors would emerge broken or radicalized or both. That night, unable to sleep, Weber overheard conversation at field headquarters where he'd been sent to deliver routine report. Guderian was present, surrounded by staff officers, arguing with Wehrmacht intelligence analyst who'd arrived from Berlin with updated assessments. The analyst, civilian expert, professor of economics recruited to interpret Soviet production data, spread documents across the map table, statistics and graphs and projections that contradicted everything German planning assumed. Herr General, Soviet factory evacuations, 1,523 facilities relocated beyond the Urals between June and September. Production capacity preserved, possibly increased due to 24-hour shifts and expanded workforce. Guderian studied the documents, face darkening with each page. Impossible. We've destroyed 20,000 Soviet tanks, 15,000 aircraft. How do they have more? Because we destroyed existing forces, Herr General, but they're producing faster than we're destroying. August production, 500 T-34 tanks. German production same period, 250 tanks total, all models, all fronts. September production projected 600 T-34s versus our 275. Silence descended like physical weight. Staff officers exchanged glances, none willing to articulate implications. The analyst continued, voice carrying academic detachment that made horror statistics palatable. Siberian divisions, 30 fresh divisions identified, currently en route to Moscow sector. Total strength, 300,000 men, fully equipped, winter-trained. German casualties, June through September, 450,000 killed, wounded, missing. Replacement rate, insufficient to maintain current operational strength past November. Guderian's response came after pause long enough to feel like defeat. Then why did we stop at Smolensk for 2 months? Nobody answered because the answer condemned the strategy, condemned Hitler's decision-making, condemned the entire invasion's premise. Smolensk had consumed 5 weeks, July 10th to August 15th, extended another week for Kiev redeployment. 5 weeks during which Moscow remained unmolested. Factories evacuated, defenses erected, Siberian divisions mobilized. 5 weeks purchased with 300,000 Soviet lives and 250,000 German lives. Arithmetic that made sense only if you understood that the Soviets could afford their losses and Germans couldn't. Weber listened, unseen in the headquarters tense shadows, understanding crystallizing like ice formation. Slow, inevitable, spreading until the entire structure of belief cracked and collapsed. Germany had won at Smolensk tactically, captured the city, surrounded the forces, achieved objectives outlined in operational plans. But the Soviets had won strategically, delayed the advance, evacuated factories, prepared Moscow, transformed tactical defeat into strategic necessity. He returned to his tank, sat in commander's hatch, stared at stars visible through breaks in cloud cover, wondered how many of those stars were already dead, light still traveling toward Earth from stellar corpses that had ceased existing millennia ago. Maybe Germany was like that, already dead, still moving through momentum, light still shining but source extinguished, just hadn't received notification yet. September 28, 1941. Mozhaisk defensive line, 120 kilometers west of Moscow. Major Dmitri Volkov stood before 400 men who ranged in age from 16 to 55, conscripts drawn from Moscow's factories and universities and collective farms, issued uniforms that didn't fit, and rifles that might fire if ammunition was available. Trained in tactics that hadn't worked in 1914 and wouldn't work now. Your job was transforming them into soldiers before Germans arrived, which meant teaching them how to die effectively, how to delay enemy long enough for someone else to kill them, how to accept that survival was statistical impossibility and duty meant dying anyway. The training ground occupied former Wheatfield, trampled into mud by 6 weeks of constant use, marked with wooden targets representing German tanks and trenches representing defensive positions, and flags representing objectives that would be captured by Germans regardless of how well the training went. You began with basics because basics were foundation, and without foundation, everything collapsed. Comrades, the Great Patriotic War has taught us many lessons. I will share 3. 400 faces, varying degrees of attention, some taking notes, some staring blankly, some already resigned to death and just waiting for it to arrive. Lesson 1. Germans are not supermen. They bleed when shot, burn when ignited, die when killed. But they are professional soldiers with superior equipment, and combined arms doctrine. You will not defeat them through courage alone. You will defeat them through patience, through making every meter cost blood, through dying slowly enough to matter. Silence. Not the silence of understanding, but the silence of men processing information that contradicted propaganda they'd been fed since childhood. Lesson 2. Your life is worth more dead than alive. Each hour you hold a position equals 10 T-34 tanks built in Urals. Each day you delay enemy equals one Siberian division arriving at front. You are not fighting to win, you are fighting to buy time. Acceptable arithmetic. One conscript, teenager, maybe 17, face showing combination of fear and defiance, raised his hand, spoke without waiting for permission. Comrade Major, propaganda says we'll drive fascists back to Berlin. You're saying we'll die here. Which is true? Both. Some of you will drive fascists to Berlin. Most of you will die here. The ones who live long enough to reach Berlin will do so because the ones who died here bought them that opportunity. History is written by survivors, but history is made by the dead. You pause, let that sink in. Watch comprehension and horror war across young faces. Lesson 3. This war will not end quickly. Winter is coming. Germans are not prepared for winter. Their tanks freeze, their weapons jam, their soldiers lack warm uniforms. But winter doesn't win wars. Winter creates opportunities. You are that opportunity. Every German soldier you kill this winter is one fewer defending Berlin in spring. Every hour you hold is 1 hour closer to victory. The training continued. Practical application of theory, teaching them how to dig trenches that wouldn't collapse under artillery, how to aim rifles at center mass instead of heads, how to throw grenades without blowing themselves up, how to identify German tanks by silhouette so they didn't waste anti-tank weapons on infantry carriers, teaching them how to die. The fundamental skill of Soviet soldiers in 1941, dying in ways that advance strategic objectives, dying as tactical resource, dying as acceptable loss in arithmetic that sacrificed thousands to save millions. After training, one conscript approached, female sniper, 18 years old, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, would survive the war with 309 confirmed kills, but today was just terrified teenager trying to understand her role in Catastrophe. Comrade Major, you fought at Smolensk? Yes. Did you hold? We held long enough. How many survived from your battalion? 35 from 1,200. Her face went pale, doing mathematics, calculating her own odds, arriving at conclusion that 3% survival rate meant statistical certainty of death. Then why do you keep fighting? The question deserved honest answer, not propaganda, not tactical necessity, not acceptable arithmetic. Honesty owed to 18-year-old who would probably die in her first engagement, but deserved to know why. Because if we don't, Russia falls. If Russia falls, Ukraine falls, Belarus falls, Georgia falls. Everything falls until there's nothing left except German occupation stretching to Urals. We fight because the alternative is extinction. Not just our deaths, our culture's death, our language's death, our people's death. So yes, you'll probably die, but your death prevents 1,000 others. Acceptable arithmetic. She nodded, saluted, returned to her unit. Would deploy to Sevastopol in November, kill her first German in December, become legend by spring. But today she was just scared girl accepting death sentence with grace that would have made ancient Greeks weep. October 6, 1941. Operation Typhoon commenced. Hitler's final gamble, last attempt to capture Moscow before winter, 1 million German soldiers advancing along 3 axes, supported by 1,000 tanks and 1,400 aircraft. Overwhelming force applied against defenders who'd had 8 weeks to prepare. 8 weeks purchased with blood at Smolensk. 8 weeks during which defenses deepened, minefields expanded, tank traps multiplied, artillery registered fields of fire, reserves moved into position. Klaus Weber's company, now operating 6 tanks cobbled together from parts cannibalized from dozens of destroyed vehicles, advanced northeast from Kyiv sector, rejoining Army Group Center's drive toward Moscow. The redeployment required 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which autumn rains began and roads transformed from dust to soup, requiring tanks to drive cross-country through fields that sucked at treads like quicksand. October the 2nd through 20th. Rapid advance, Germans breaking through first defensive line, second defensive line, capturing towns whose names Weber couldn't pronounce, achieving penetrations that looked impressive on maps and felt hollow in reality, because the Soviets weren't collapsing, weren't surrendering, weren't even fighting that hard at first contact. They were withdrawing to prepared positions, making Germans advance through minefields and artillery zones, trading space for time, bleeding the offensive before it reached Moscow proper. October 7th. First rain. Not heavy, just persistent drizzle that turned dust to mud and mud to glue. Weber's tank's tracks accumulated mud until each rotation required mechanical advantage that strained the transmission, reducing speed from 30 kilometers per hour to 15. October 12th. Heavy rain. Roads ceased being roads, became rivers of liquid earth flowing downhill, drowning vehicles that couldn't maintain momentum. Weber's company advanced 15 kilometers in 24 hours, purchasing each kilometer with fuel consumption that logistics couldn't sustain. October 15th, 3 kilometers advancement, stopped not by Soviet resistance but by mud that swallowed tanks to their turret rings, required recovery vehicles to extract them, required hours of winching and digging and cursing machinery that worked perfectly in testing grounds but failed catastrophically in Russian autumn. October 18th, stuck, completely, absolutely, mechanically stuck. 32 kilometers from Moscow center, close enough to see Kremlin's spires through binoculars when cloud cover lifted, close enough to hear church bells on quiet mornings, close enough to smell the city, but not close enough to reach it. Weber stood on his tank's hull, binoculars pressed to eyes staring at the golden domes that represented objective, victory, end of campaign. So close, impossibly far. Hauptmann Steiner climbed onto the hull beside him, also staring, also calculating distance between current position and objective, also understanding that 32 kilometers might as well be 300. We can't advance. The mud won't support us. We wait for freeze. When does it freeze, sir? November, usually. Maybe late October if we're lucky. October 20th. First snow. Light dusting, melted by afternoon, but prophetic, warning of transformation coming, summer to autumn to winter, campaign season to hibernation season, advance to stasis. October 22nd. Temperature dropped to -5 Celsius at night. Tank engines froze, required heating fires beneath them to restart. Fires that consumed wood that required scavenging, that required time, that delayed advance, that cost opportunities that wouldn't return. Weber's final journal entry, written October 25th, hands so cold he could barely hold the pen, ink freezing in the inkwell, requiring him to warm it with breath before each sentence. October 25th, 1941. 30 kilometers from Moscow, can see the city, can't reach it. The Russians were right. We spent too long at Smolensk. Summer is gone. Winter is here. And we're dying. Not from bullets, from cold, from frostbite, from pneumonia. From vehicles that won't start and weapons that won't fire, and the slow realization that we're not going to win. Smolensk's curse is real. We bled there for 8 weeks. Now we freeze here for however long winter lasts. The Russian I met at Smolensk, he knew. He understood what we didn't. That victory isn't about winning battles. It's about surviving until your enemy can't fight anymore. We can't fight anymore. We're out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of time. Moscow stands, Russia lives, and Germany is learning the lesson that Napoleon learned, and Sweden learned, and Poland learned, and everyone who invaded Russia learned that this country doesn't fight with armies alone. It fights with distance and winter and the arithmetic of acceptable losses. I won't see Christmas, won't see Anna or Greta again, won't return to Munich or Bavaria or the garage where I repaired trucks before the war. I'll die here, 30 kilometers from objective, and someone will write letter to Anna saying I died heroically And it will be lie. There's nothing heroic about freezing to death in a broken tank outside a city you can see but can't reach. He didn't finish the entry. Couldn't finish because his fingers stopped working. Frostbite creeping from extremities toward core. Body shutting down systems to preserve vital functions, prioritizing survival over comfort or consciousness, or the ability to write final thoughts. November 15, 1941. Weber's closest approach to Moscow, 32 kilometers, never closer, mathematical limit beyond which German forces couldn't penetrate. Temperature, -20 Celsius. Wind chill, -35. Conditions incompatible with mechanized warfare, incompatible with human survival without proper winter equipment, incompatible with everything German planning had assumed about Russia and campaigns and the speed with which modern armies conquered territory. Weber's company, 6 tanks, 0 operational. Engine blocks cracked from freezing, fuel gelled to consistency of tar, weapons jammed with ice. 3 tanks operational, 0 tanks functional. Distinction without meaning. Personnel, 140 men in June, 43 men in September, 19 men in November. Not from combat losses, from frostbite, pneumonia, exposure, the slow attrition of cold applied to flesh designed for temperate climates. Weber himself, frostbite in fingers, toes, nose, ears. Pneumonia developing, cough-producing, bloody sputum that froze before it hit ground. Weight loss sufficient that uniform hung loose, belt cinched to last hole and still sliding. Age 28, looked 50, felt 80. December 5, 1941. Soviet counteroffensive began. Fresh Siberian divisions, winter-trained, winter-equipped, attacking German positions held by soldiers who couldn't feel their fingers, couldn't operate weapons, couldn't run because frostbitten feet wouldn't support running. The German line broke. Not tactically, strategically. Wholesale retreat, first German retreat of entire war, Army Group Center withdrawing from Moscow approaches, abandoning positions, abandoning equipment, abandoning wounded who couldn't walk because walking required boots and boots were frozen to frostbitten feet. Weber participated in retreat for 3 days, walking because tank was abandoned, weapons were abandoned, everything was abandoned except survival instinct that kept feet moving despite pain. December 6, 1941. Fell during retreat, couldn't rise, tried 3 times, failed, lay in snow waiting for someone to help or shoot or just let him freeze. Soviet patrol found him 4 hours later. He was still conscious, barely, hypothermic and delirious, speaking German and occasionally Russian, phrases learned from prisoners, apologizing for invasion. For Smolensk, for everything. They shot him. Mercy killing or execution, distinction without difference. 9mm round through temple, instant cessation of consciousness, body left in snow because burying dead required effort better spent pursuing living enemies. Klaus Weber, age 28, tank commander, husband, father, died December 6, 1941, 38 kilometers west of Moscow, 6 months and 14 days after invasion began, Christmas unreached, promises unkept, letters unmailed. December 8, 1941. Soviet forces recaptured ground lost during October advance. Major Dmitri Volkov's regiment, 234th Training Regiment, now 234th Rifle Regiment, because training ended when fighting began, participated in counteroffensive, advancing through snow that reached mid-thigh, temperature -25, wind-creating conditions where exposed flesh froze in minutes. Your unit overran abandoned German positions, found evidence of hasty retreat, equipment left behind, supplies abandoned, foxholes still containing frozen corpses of soldiers who died from exposure before combat found them. One position contained German tank, Panzer IV, tracks frozen solid, turret hatch open, interior visible. You climbed onto the hull, looked inside, saw 3 corpses frozen in position suggesting they died seeking warmth. Huddled together, arms wrapped around each other, final human gesture before cold claimed them. Driver's compartment contained personal effects, photographs, letters, journal written in German that you couldn't read but recognized as final thoughts, confessions. the particular desperation of men who understood they were dying. One photograph showed German soldier, tank commander, probably, with wife and daughter, little girl maybe 4 years old, all smiling, background suggesting Munich or some other Bavarian city, taken before war when hope still existed. You pocketed the photograph, the journal, the letters, would attempt to deliver them through Red Cross channels after war, assuming war ended, assuming you survived, assuming anything beyond next hour was worth planning for. But looking at the photograph, you felt recognition, not of the specific soldier, but of the general humanity, the universal fatherhood, the shared mortality that transcended uniform and nationality, and the arbitrary divisions that made you enemies. This could be the German from Smolensk, the one who let me live. No way to confirm, no way to know. Just possibility hanging in frozen air like breath vapor that dissipated before achieving meaning. You climbed down from the tank, continued advance, past dozens more abandoned vehicles, hundreds more frozen corpses, evidence of catastrophe that would be measured in hundreds of thousands once counting finished. That night, in captured German dugout that provided shelter from wind, you opened the journal, tried to decipher German script through combination of context and cognates and linguistic guesswork. Made out enough to understand. Tank commander, married, daughter named Greta, stationed at Smolensk in July and August, redeployed to Kiev in September, returned to Moscow sector in October, stuck in mud, frozen in place, dying slowly from cold and understanding, and the curse that followed Wehrmacht from Smolensk to Moscow. The final entry, barely legible, written with fingers that couldn't grip pen properly. Smolensk's curse is real. You closed the journal, placed it carefully in your pack, decided that after war, if there was after war, you'd attempt to find Anna Weber, deliver her husband's effects, tell her he died. What? Heroically? Pointlessly? Necessarily? Tell her he died. That was sufficient. That was all anyone needed to know. The Battle of Smolensk officially ended September 10, 1941. Its consequences extended indefinitely. Soviet losses, 300,000 killed, wounded, captured. 70% casualty rate, statistically catastrophic, strategically essential. Those 300,000 bought 8 weeks that saved Moscow, 8 weeks that enabled factory evacuations and Siberian mobilizations and defensive preparations that stopped Wehrmacht 30 kilometers from Kremlin. German losses, 250,000 killed, wounded, 25% casualty rate, tactically acceptable, strategically catastrophic. Those 250,000 represented irreplaceable veterans, experienced soldiers, professional army that couldn't be reconstituted through conscription and training. Strategic outcome, German tactical victory, Soviet strategic triumph. City captured, forces surrounded, objectives achieved, but campaign timeline destroyed. Moscow offensive delayed. Winter arrived with Wehrmacht unprepared. Counteroffensive crushed German units that couldn't maneuver in snow. The mathematics were simple, brutal, prophetic. Smolensk cost Germany time it couldn't afford to lose, and cost Soviet Union lives it could afford to lose. Acceptable arithmetic applied at scale that crushed nations. Klaus Weber's body was recovered by German forces in January 1942 during brief recapture of territory lost in December. Buried in mass grave near Klin, 400 soldiers interred without individual markers because marking graves required time and materials better spent on living. The grave was destroyed in 1944 when Soviet forces recaptured region. No marker remained, no record existed, just soil that contained bones and buttons and belt buckles mixed with mud. Anna Weber received death notification in March 1942. Telegram delivered by postal worker who delivered 300 similar telegrams that month and would deliver thousands more before war ended. She cried for 3 days, then stopped crying because crying required energy, better spent on Greta who needed food and education, and reason to believe that Papa's death meant something. 1968. Greta Weber, 31 years old, married, 2 children of her own, visited Soviet Union through cultural exchange program. Traveled to Smolensk, searched for father's grave, found memorial listing names of German dead. 8,000 names on marble wall. Klaus Weber among them, reduced to letters carved in stone. She placed flowers at memorial, stood in silence, tried to imagine father she barely remembered. Man who existed mostly through photographs and mother stories and letters written from front lines. An elderly Soviet veteran approached, maybe 70, wearing medals that covered his chest, walking with cane that suggested old wound. German girl at memorial for fascists. What do you seek? My father. He died here. 1941. The veteran studied her face, searching for something, finding it or pretending to. Many died here. Soviet, German, all dead together now. War made us enemies. Time makes us brothers in grief. Did you fight at Smolensk? Yes, July through August. I survived. Your father. Maybe I killed him. Maybe he killed my comrade. We'll never know. War is fog. Truth dies first. He offered his flask, vodka, universal solvent for grief and memory. She accepted, drank, coughed because vodka was stronger than German beer. Your father fought well. All Germans fought well. But they fought for wrong reasons in wrong place at wrong time. Russia is not conquered in summer. Your father learned that. Every invader learns that. Memory is expensive teacher. Major Dmitri Volkov survived war, promoted to colonel by 1945, participated in Berlin capture, saw Reichstag burning and swastika flag falling and Wehrmacht surrendering. Returned to Kiev 1946, found university destroyed, rebuilt it over 5 years, resumed teaching history with particular emphasis on Great Patriotic War. 1963, published memoir censored by Soviet authorities, published in full only after 1991 collapse. Key passage describing Smolensk. I teach students that Smolensk saved Moscow, that our sacrifice was glorious, that every death advanced victory. But nights alone, I see Private Gromov's face, hear Commissar Petrov's last words. Remember German soldier who let me live at Slutsk and whom I probably killed through delay at Smolensk. History calls it victory. I call it survival. There's difference. 300,000 Soviet soldiers died at Smolensk. We bought 8 weeks with their lives. Arithmetic says excellent exchange rate. Humanity says catastrophe. Both true simultaneously. War makes monsters of necessary men and necessities of monstrous acts. We did what required doing. History judges whether requirements justified actions. I sleep poorly. Volkov died 1977, age 70, heart attack, buried in Kiev with military honors. Funeral attended by thousands, veterans and students and civilians who understood that Soviet Union survived because men like Volkov accepted mathematics of sacrifice. Present day, 2023. Smolensk Regional Museum, Great Patriotic War Exhibit. Display case contains 2 uniforms, side by side. German Wehrmacht, Soviet Red Army. Both torn, blood-stained, preserved through chemistry that prevented decay but couldn't prevent memory. Placard beneath, at Smolensk, 1941, 300,000 Soviet soldiers and 250,000 German soldiers became statistics. But each was son, father, husband, brother. Their sacrifice was not glorious. It was necessary. May we remember them not as soldiers, but as men. Photographs accompany uniforms. Klaus Weber, official Wehrmacht portrait, smiling confidently, believing in quick victory. Dmitri Volkov, official Red Army portrait, serious, already understanding what war meant. Below photographs, quote, etched in glass, Russia does not fight wars to win battles. Russia fights wars to survive winters. Those who forget this die in snow, 30 kilometers from objective, wondering how summer's certainty became winter's grave. Major General Dmitri Volkov, Memoir, 1963. Outside museum, autumn day, leaves falling from trees that grew from soil fertilized by corpses, roots drawing sustenance from battlefield converted to park. Tour guide, young woman, maybe 25, leads group of Western tourists through courtyard where Assumption Cathedral once stood. Now rebuilt, dome shining, cross reaching toward sky. Tourist asks, why rebuild? Why not leave it as memorial? Guide responds, because life continues, because beauty matters, because we don't honor dead by preserving death, we honor them by living. She points at Cathedral Courtyard, old stones worn by centuries. Tank treads 1941, still visible if you look carefully. We left them. Some scars remain, some must remain. Memory requires evidence. Elderly man watches from park bench, 90 plus, face showing age and something else. Witness to history, survivor of catastrophe, keeper of memory that younger generations access through museums, but he accessed through participation. He holds photograph, faded, creased from handling. Two young men, different uniforms, same exhausted eyes, same knowledge that tomorrow might not come. Nobody knows who they were. Nobody asks. Old man keeps secrets because secrets are burden, and sharing burden diminishes it but doesn't eliminate it. He stands slowly, joints protesting, walks toward cathedral, enters courtyard, kneels at spot where tank treads, marked stone 82 years ago, traces grooves with fingers that remember touching steel and earth and corpses. We held Klaus. 36 days. You were right, Smolensk was curse, but curse worked both ways. You froze before Moscow. We bled at Smolensk. Both of us died. Russia lived. He places photograph on ground, weighted with stone so wind won't steal it, offering to dead or gods or history, whichever accepts offerings from old men with too much memory and too little time. The photograph shows two soldiers in burning village, rifles lowered, eyes meeting across smoke and fire. Moment of truce that history wouldn't record, but memory couldn't forget. Klaus Weber and Dmitri Volkov, enemies who shared humanity for 100 seconds, August 12, 1941, before resuming war that killed one and scarred the other, and proved that arithmetic of acceptable losses calculates everything except cost to those who survive. The cathedral bells ring, announcing evening service. Sound carrying across city that died and lived and remembers in stone and soil, and scars that won't heal because healing would mean forgetting, and forgetting would mean their deaths were meaningless. So Smolensk remembers, rebuilds, lives. And every autumn, when leaves fall and air grows cold, the city whispers to those who listen. This is what sacrifice bought. This is what 300,000 Soviet lives and 250,000 German lives purchased. This is the arithmetic made flesh, survival priced in blood, victory measured in corpses, peace earned through catastrophe. And every winter, when snow falls and wind howls and temperature drops below freezing, the ghosts of Smolensk gather in ruined positions and abandoned foxholes and mass graves that became parks. And they ask the question that survives when bodies don't. Was it worth it? History answers, yes. Strategy demanded it. Arithmetic justified it. Victory required it. Humanity answers, no. Nothing justifies this. No calculation makes corpses acceptable. No victory erases what was lost. Both answers true. Both answers false. Truth exists in tension between strategic necessity and human cost, between collective survival and individual extinction, between the living who inherited peace and the dead who purchased it with their only currency, themselves. The bells continue ringing. The guide continues explaining. The tourists continue taking photographs. The old man continues remembering. And Smolensk continues standing, testament to arithmetic that calculated human life as tactical resource and found that sometimes in mathematics of war, acceptable losses are only acceptable to those who survive to calculate them. The city endures. The dead remain dead. And the lesson persists. Russia is not conquered in summer. Those who try die in winter, 30 kilometers from objective, learning what Smolensk taught and Moscow confirmed, and history repeated until the lesson became prophecy. Some victories cost more than defeat. Some battles won destroy the winner, and some cities burned and broken and rebuilt become eternal warnings that arithmetic without humanity creates deserts and calls them peace.